Chapter 268. The heads of the major companies in the conference room had all climbed up from the bottom of Hollywood, so they were very familiar with the tricks of Hollywood. After a few hours of discussion, a series of strategies against Firefly and Eric were formulated. The 6 CEOs even divided the benefits that each company would receive after Eric gave in. After Thanksgiving, Eric entered the last busy period of the year. In the plan, as long as he finished this month, Eric could rest for a long time starting in late December. Drew was even thinking about whether the two of them should go on a holiday during Christmas. Eric had been at Fox's audition for the lead role of The X-Files all morning. Since The X-Files received far more attention than in his previous life, the selection of the male and female leads that would support the entire series was also very careful. Because of the success of Friends, the competition for the male and female leads of The X-Files, led by Eric, was very fierce. Several famous actors who had not been very successful in Hollywood in the past 2 years had participated in the audition. Although the audition had entered the second round, the selection of the male lead had not been completed in the morning, and none of the auditionees could satisfy Eric. Moreover, Eric did not consider the two in his previous life. Because in the original version, no matter what kind of mood the male lead, David Duchovny, was in, the faintly discernible smile at the corner of his mouth would never disappear, giving people a feeling that he was out of character. Therefore, Eric did not intend to give him this role from the beginning. In his previous life, the producer chose David Duchovny as the male lead mainly because his salary was very low. As for the female lead, Gillian Anderson, she was even less in line with Eric's expectations, not to mention that she had not yet debuted. The female lead of The X-Files, Dana Scarlett, was supposed to be a woman with a high IQ who graduated from the University of Maryland, had a degree in physics and law, and was a teacher in the FBI. However, the petite Gillian Anderson did not have the temperament that a woman with a high IQ should have in the show. Instead, she was more like the little secretary of the male lead, Fox Muller. In Eric's imagination, the actress playing the role of Dana Scarlett should be tall and slender, with a shrewd and capable temperament. It would be best if she had a cold and elegant aura. It would be best if this character could be on par with the male lead in the drama, and not be a vassal of the male lead. After having lunch in Century City, Eric could only leave the afternoon audition to the two producers because he had to return to Firefly headquarters to attend the first annual meeting after the merger of Firefly and New Line. "I'm really sorry, Carolyn. There was a traffic jam on the way here." Eric hurriedly pushed open the door to his office and apologized to the brown-haired woman in her 40s. This woman's name was Carolyn Elliott. She had opened an accounting firm that was quite famous in the industry. Firefly and Eric's personal finances had always been outsourced to Carolyn Elliott's firm. Seeing that Eric was in a hurry, Carolyn, who had been waiting for a long time and indeed had some resentment in her heart, could only chuckle and say, "It's okay, Eric. I just got here not long ago." Eric did not go to his desk. Instead, he sat down on the sofa opposite Carolyn and said, "Carolyn, have you sorted out my personal financial information?" Carolyn took out the prepared information from her bag and placed it on her lap. She raised her head and asked, "Eric now?" Eric looked at his watch. There were still more than 20 minutes before the meeting at 2:30 in the afternoon. He thought that it should be enough to hear about his financial situation, so he nodded. Carolyn flipped open the information and began to report, "Eric, your main income this year comes from a few movies. Among them, Home Alone received $120 million US. Fox bought the overseas distribution rights and earned $24 million US. In addition, Home Alone received a total of $32 million US from the videotape and TV broadcast rights for the second half of the year. Home Alone currently has a total income of $176 million US. Although Carolyn Elliott had read through the data many times, and the data had been personally compiled by her, she still felt as though she had lived her entire life in vain when she read it out loud in front of this young man who wasn't even 20 years old yet. After a brief moment of sighing and being distracted, Carolyn Elliott quickly turned her attention to the information and continued to read, "Because Firefly and New Line will only achieve a financial merger next year, the box office share of all the movies released by Firefly this year will still belong to you. The global box office share of Pretty Woman is $102 million US. Currently, the videotape and TV broadcast rights have only earned $19 million for a total of $121 million. In addition, the global box office of Dark War is $88 million. Currently, there is no videotape share. The advertising share of Friends is $29 million. These two sums of money have not been received yet. According to the contract, Columbia and Fox will complete the payment before December 31st. In addition to these main box office earnings, Firefly's advertising department has a total income of $18 million through the advertising placements of Pretty Woman, Dark War, Home Alone 2, and Sleepless in Seattle. In addition, of the other two companies you own, Pixar Studios' profits are $0, and UTA's share is $9.3 million. At this point, Carolyn Elliott paused for a moment. She looked at Eric and said seriously, "Eric, compared to the movies, I don't think UTA can generate much profit for you. So, I personally suggest that you sell the shares of this agency as soon as possible. Otherwise, it may cause you trouble." Eric nodded. In the past 6 months, he had gradually discovered this problem. Although he owned 90% of UTA's shares, it did not mean that 90% of UTA's artists' commissions were his. The company could only get a small part of the 10% commission from the artists. Most of it still went to the artists' direct agents. Therefore, even though Kapoor only held 10% of UTA's shares, if one only counted the income of the management company, Kapoor, who had the management contracts of Al Pacino, Julia Roberts, and several other A-list celebrities, earned no less than Eric. It should be known that managers didn't just take a cut of the film's salary. They also took a cut of the actor's income from endorsements and other channels. In addition, in order to avoid suspicion, Eric could no longer interfere in any of UTA's affairs. Therefore, this part of the shares was dispensable to him and could be transferred out at any time. "I'll think about it, Carolyn. Continue." Carolyn Elliott continued reading. "In summary, your income this year is $441 million, of which 2 payments totaling $117 million have not been received. Next is the expenditure. Firefly has participated in the production of a total of 7 movies this year. The expenditure for Dark War is $0, and the other 6 include various personnel dividends. The total cost is $84 million. The acquisition of Pixar Studios and the subsequent investment totaled $30 million. The acquisition of New Line cost $60 million, and the acquisition of Fox's shares cost $80 million. In addition, the construction of the manor in Malibu totaled $27 million. Your personal credit card account covers several large expenses, totaling $14 million. Also, Carolyn Elliott looked at Eric strangely and said, "Also, Miss Barrymore's credit card expenses totaled $56 million. The total expenditure is $309 million. Eric, before Columbia and Fox pay the other 2 payments, you only have $15 million at your disposal. And even if these 2 payments are received, you can't use them as you wish. Because even after some reasonable tax avoidance, you still have to pay $140 million in taxes this year." The reason Eric had specially asked Carolyn to help him sort out his financial situation was to prepare for the upcoming investment company. After a few days of consideration, Chris Hansen had already agreed. According to the information collected by Chris, when Cisco went public, its share price would be $18, and its total market value would only be $224 million. Eric knew that this would be the only time he would get Cisco's shares at such a low price. After Cisco went public, its share price would soar. At that time, even if he wanted to buy it, the investment companies would not be willing to sell their shares. Therefore, Eric naturally wanted to get as many shares as possible this time. But now, he realized that his remaining funds were not even enough to pay taxes. "Carolyn, can you apply for an extension of the tax payment?" Eric asked tentatively. He just happened to know of a way to extend the tax payment by half a year. If it could be delayed until the second half of next year, then the profits from the movies released at the end of the year would definitely be in his account, and his financial situation would be very relaxed. Carolyn shook her head. Eric, whether it's Firefly or your personal financial situation, it's very simple. There's no way to get an extension from the IRS through financial means. If you wanted to get an extension from the beginning, you should have informed me at least half a year ago. It's too late now. Eric smiled bitterly and said, "Looks like I'll have to take a loan again." "Alright, Carolyn, what do you think of Firefly?" Carolyn was puzzled. "What are you talking about?" "You should know that after the merger with New Line, we can no longer outsource our finances to your firm after this year." Carolyn Elliott's heart sank. Firefly was her biggest client. If she lost this client, her firm's income would drop by at least half. However, Carolyn suddenly realized that Eric's words had a hidden meaning. "Eric, are you saying that you want to?" "Yes." Eric smiled and nodded. "I want to invite you to Firefly to be the CFO. Although by doing so, you will have no choice but to close down your firm. But I'm sure you'll realize that Firefly is worth it." Chapter 269. I need a few months to finish the business I have now. Carolyn had almost no hesitation. As Eric said, everyone could see Firefly's current development potential. Between the boss of a small accounting firm and the financial director of a large company, a smart person would know which one to choose. "Of course, no problem," Eric said. Several departments in the company were now operated by Robert's subordinates. Eric did not have a suitable person, so he did not say anything. However, Eric had to pay more attention to the company's financial affairs. It was the best choice to put Carolyn Elliott, who he was familiar with, in this position. As for Robert Shea, Eric believed that as long as he was smart enough, he would not oppose his decision. The two people chatted for a while, and then walked to the office together under the staff's notice. The meeting was not long. The issues discussed were roughly the financial problems of Firefly and New Line, as well as the development plan for next year. When Carolyn Elliott reported the financial affairs of Firefly, Robert Shea's face was very interesting. This was because New Line had released 6 or 7 films, including Nightmare on Street 5, this year, but the total income was less than a fraction of the first, Home Alone. And according to the previous contract, although Robert Shea had 15% of Firefly's shares, he could only listen to Carolyn read out the profit data, but he could not get a penny from it. During this period, Eric also announced that he would appoint Carolyn Elliott as the company's financial director. Although Robert Shea could not hide his displeasure, he did not refute. The meeting was held for the whole afternoon. After it was over, Eric stopped Robert Shea, who was about to leave, and asked, "Robert, how is the preparation for the release of the Golden Jade League videotape?" "I have customized the first batch of 100,000 videotapes." "Eric, do you really think that the Golden Jade League can rely on the influence of Sleepless in Seattle to sell again?" Robert Shea asked doubtfully. Eric nodded affirmatively. "Of course, Robert. 100,000 boxes is too little. We need at least 300,000 boxes for the first batch. Try to pay attention to this." Robert Shea shook his head like a rattledrum. "Eric, this is too risky. I think 100,000 boxes is more than enough, and we've already spent 1 million. We'll definitely have to fork out a sum of money for publicity in the future. If the videotape really sells well, we can get the factory to rush it." "What if we can't make it in time?" Eric asked. "Robert, trust me. Make 300,000 boxes and distribute them. Tell those distributors that they can sell first and pay later. We must ensure that all the channels we can reach have the videotape of Golden Jade League." This. Robert was still a little hesitant. In his opinion, an old movie from more than 30 years ago, after being stimulated by Sleepless in Seattle, being able to sell 100,000 boxes was already very good. However, Eric directly asked him to produce 300,000 boxes and use such a sales method. In Robert's opinion, this was no different from throwing money into the water. Eric thought for a while and said, "Robert, listen to me this time, okay? If I'm proven to be wrong, then I won't interfere with anything in the company's operation for a year." Robert was immediately moved when he heard Eric's words. What he was most afraid of was that Eric would interfere with the company's operation. Due to the age prejudice, Robert didn't think that Eric had any talent in running a film company. He only had his current wealth and status because of the continuous success of several movies. In this case, he should honestly make movies instead of making irresponsible remarks about the company's operation. However, what made him helpless was that Eric owned 85% of the company's shares. With Eric's promise, even if it was just verbal, Robert Shea felt that he could take a gamble. The cost of 300,000 boxes of videotapes was only $3 million. In Robert's opinion, it was worth it in exchange for his absolute control of Firefly for a year. Okay, Eric, I will implement your plan as soon as possible. Eric watched Robert Shea leave and smiled, thinking that this method might be able to continue, using such a bait to drive Robert to do things according to his will. After packing up, Eric left the office and prepared to drive home. Just as he walked out of the office building, a brown-haired white woman in her 30s walked over and stopped him. When Eric stopped, the woman eagerly introduced herself. "Mr. Williams, I'm Sherisa Cody. Do you remember me? We've met before." Eric had almost forgotten about Sherisa Cody, whom he had met once in New York. However, it was impossible for him not to recognize the man behind this woman, Brad Pitt. However, compared to Sherisa Cody's eagerness, Pitt looked a lot more awkward. It seemed that he was definitely against his agent taking the initiative to come to him. "Hello, Miss Cody, we meet again." Eric smiled and shook hands with the other party. He felt that this matter was quite interesting. He originally thought that he would never see Brad Pitt again after that incident. Sherisa Cody saw that Eric remembered her and a smile appeared on her face. He had to admit that this woman took good care of herself. Eric was not sure how old she was. "Mr. Williams, do you still remember your original invitation?" "I've already joined UTA with my team." Eric recalled for a moment and remembered that there was indeed such a thing. When he saw Sherisa taking the initiative to bring Brad Pitt to apologize, he felt that this woman was very good at dealing with people, so he said it casually. However, Eric looked at the two people in front of him and asked, "When did this happen?" A week ago," Sherisa replied. After seeing that Eric did not show any other expression, the woman quickly said, "Mr. Williams, can I invite you to dinner?" Eric looked at Sherisa Cody, then glanced at Brad Pitt, who was forcing a polite smile behind the woman. He quickly remembered the purpose of the other party's visit. "Ms. Cody, did Mr. Pitt participate in the audition for the male lead of The X-Files?" Sherisa Cody smiled awkwardly when she saw that Eric had exposed the matter. Then, she said, "Mr. Williams, Brad participated in the audition this afternoon. Unfortunately, you weren't there in the afternoon. That's why I came here personally to talk to you." "All right then." Eric glanced at Brad Pitt behind the woman. "Mr. Pitt, you don't have to go. Go back and wait for the news." When Brad Pitt heard this, his expression suddenly became a little awkward. Sherisa Cody realized that Eric still did not like Brad behind her, so she could only give the man standing behind her a look. "Then, I'll go back first." Brad Pitt finally spoke. "Mr. Williams, bye. Eric only nodded slightly at the other party. After Brad Pitt drove away alone, Eric opened his car door and said to Sherisa Cody, "Ms. Cody, please get in the car." "Oh, thank you." The woman quickly got into the passenger seat. In a restaurant, after ordering, Sherisa Cody said impatiently, "Mr. Williams, Pitt's acting is actually very good. If you don't believe me, you can go and watch the video of Pitt's audition for The X-Files. He just hasn't encountered any good opportunities." Eric certainly knew that Brad Pitt's acting was very good. The other party had received more acting awards and nominations than Tom Cruise. However, so what? There were countless people with excellent acting skills in Hollywood who could not make a name for themselves, but there were only so many opportunities. However, looking at the woman in front of him, a playful smile appeared at the corners of Eric's mouth. "Ms. Cody, do you only have one actor, Brad Pitt, under you?" Sherisa Cody did not know why Eric suddenly asked this, but she still shook her head and said, "No, there are 4 or 5 more." Eric shrugged. "Oh, then you're really good to Brad." Sharissa Cody's face suddenly turned slightly red. Of course, she could hear Eric's words. However, the matter of the agent and the actors under her was actually not that hard to talk about. She had also heard that a 40 or 50-year-old music producer had personally brought a 12-year-old girl to fame and even trained her to become his wife. The girl seemed to be called Celine or something. After adjusting her state of mind, Sharissa Cody said with a faint pleading tone, "Mr. Williams, can you give Pitt a chance? He definitely won't let you down." Eric looked at the woman in front of him and quickly calculated in his mind. With this hard-working agent helping Brad Pitt, although the other party was already 26 years old, male actors, especially handsome ones, had a relatively long shelf life. Brad Pitt was very likely to make a name for himself in Hollywood sooner or later. This was something that Eric was very unwilling to see. Since that was the case, giving the male lead role of The X-Files to Brad Pitt would only be bad for him and not good for him. This was because The X-Files was the same as Friends in that it was a TV series with very fixed characters. After acting for 8 to 10 seasons, it was almost impossible for the actors to change their on-screen image. The possibility of them returning to the big screen was even slimmer. In his previous life, of the 6 main leads of Friends, only Jennifer Aniston had successfully transitioned to the big screen. Moreover, Jennifer Aniston had paid a very high price. In order to transition to the big screen and not let the audience think of Rachel Green, many of the roles that Jennifer Aniston had received were very bad. Although he had made the decision in his heart, Eric was still quite kind. After thinking for a while, he directly reminded Sharissa Cody, "Ms. Cody, you have to think carefully. Once Mr. Pitt takes the role of the male lead of The X-Files, his on-screen image is very likely to be fixed. It will be very difficult for him to transition in the future. Because the male lead of this TV series has to sign a contract for at least 5 seasons. Chapter 270. Hearing Eric's words, Sharissa Cody hesitated for a moment. However, she soon realized that her hesitation was laughable. She was very clear about Brad Pitt's current situation. In the past 6 months, Brad could only occasionally play small roles in some movies or TV series. Under such circumstances, as long as he could get the role of the male lead in a blockbuster TV series, there was nothing to worry about. Many second-tier and third-tier Hollywood stars were participating in the competition for the male and female lead roles in The X-Files. After thinking this through, Sharissa Cody said, "Mr. Williams, I believe that The X-Files is definitely a very excellent TV series. If you can play the male lead in this TV series, it doesn't matter even if it's fixed." This woman really knows how to talk, Eric thought. However, Sharissa Cody continued, "However, Mr. Williams, isn't it a little too long to sign a 5-season contract in one go?" Eric immediately shook his head and said in a tone that left no room for negotiation, "It's not long at all. The 6 lead actors of Friends have all signed a 5-season contract." Sharissa Cody didn't know if Eric was telling the truth. If that was the case, she really couldn't find any reason to bargain. Moreover, even if it was a few more seasons, it seemed that she and Pitt didn't have the qualifications and chips to bargain, let alone 5 seasons. Eric observed Sharissa Cody's expression and said, "If you don't have any objections, I'll go take a look at Brad Pitt's audition tape tomorrow. If his performance can satisfy me, I'll inform you to sign the contract." The next day, Eric went to the set where Fox was in charge of the audition. He found Brad Pitt's audition tape and watched it several times. After confirming that Brad Pitt's current acting skills were indeed suitable for the role of Fox Mulder, he found the producers of Fox and Firefly to discuss it and quickly decided. What was left was the female lead and some other supporting roles. Of course, Eric didn't care about those supporting roles. He just put some energy into selecting the female lead. At the same time, another variety show promised to Fox was finally launched. After considering for a long time, Eric finally chose the safest variety show, Who Will Become a Millionaire. In his previous life, this show originated from the UK. It became popular all over the world when it first appeared in the late 90s. Eric remembered that there were many similar shows on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. Until Eric transmigrated, Who Will Become a Millionaire still hadn't left the television screen. There were often rumors of another millionaire appearing in this program in a certain country. Who Will Become a Millionaire grasped the psychology of ordinary people wanting to get rich, so it was not limited by any era. Unlike some other programs, although they might be successful in the present, it was much more troublesome to operate. Who Will Become a Millionaire was much simpler, and it was very popular. Anyone could sign up for it. Therefore, after writing the proposal, Eric first sent people to many countries around the world that paid attention to intellectual property protection to register the copyright of the show. Once the show became popular, he believed that he could make a lot of money just by selling the copyright. Hey, Eric, what do you think of this question? In Home Alone, how many brothers and sisters does Kevin have in total? In the car driving to Malibu, Drew, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, held a small hardcover notebook in her hand. She would write and draw on it from time to time. Ever since she knew about Eric's plan for Who Will Become a Millionaire, the little girl was very enthusiastic about thinking about all kinds of strange questions. She even hoped that Eric would use the questions she collected in the show. When Eric heard the little girl's question, he smiled and shook his head. No, I already said that the design questions must be related to life, and it must be very interesting. Your question is completely testing people's memory. Who would be so free as to care about how many brothers and sisters Kevin has? Drew pouted and retorted, then the question you designed is even more boring. Who would be so free as to care about how insects breathe? Eric helplessly stared at the little girl. It's obvious that you didn't pay attention at all when you were in school. This question must be in the biology textbook. You're quibbling. Only nerds care about these questions. The little girl shook her curly hair and bit the ballpoint pen in her hand for a while. Then she asked, "What about this one? When did the Hollywood sign appear?" Eric nodded and said, "This is a good question. Write it down, write it down." Hee, the little girl smiled proudly and wrote it down in a small notebook. Eric thought for a while, then looked at the little girl and asked, "By the way, I really don't know when the Hollywood sign was set up. What year was it?" The little girl rolled her eyes at Eric and said confidently, "How would I know?" Eric was a little speechless. He asked, "Then how did you come up with this question?" "I just happened to pass by there yesterday." The little girl pondered for a while with the ballpoint pen under her chin. Then, she looked up at the road in front of her and asked, "How far is it?" Eric looked out the car window and said, "We'll be there in 5 minutes." The car drove on the highway for a while before stopping outside the manor in the corner of Malibu. Eric opened the door and got out of the car. However, he heard the little girl screaming in the car. Yeah, Eric, I knocked my knee. Hurry up and carry me out. Climb out yourself." Eric thought that the little girl was up to mischief again. He ignored her and walked straight to Frank Gehry and his private lawyer Edward, who were waiting at the entrance of the manor. "Wow, Eric, you're so cruel." Eric was just about to reach out his hand to Frank Gehry, who was enthusiastically welcoming him when a small body jumped on his back. Eric reprimanded, "Stop fooling around. Can't you see that there are so many people here? If you make any more mischief, I'll stuff you into the trunk." "I really knocked my knee. It's red. Take a look if you don't believe me," the little girl behind him said aggrievedly. Eric scooped up the little girl hanging on his back and held her in his arms. He looked at the little girl's white and tender calf that was exposed under her knee-length pleated skirt. Although there was indeed a small bruise on it, it was neither bleeding nor swollen. "You won't limp. You'll be fine after running for 2 kilometers. With that said, Eric wanted to put down Drew. The little girl giggled and fooled around with her arms around his neck for a while before reluctantly letting go. Just as Eric let go of Drew, he sensed someone looking in his direction from the corner of his eye. He looked in the direction of his intuition, but he didn't see anyone. He thought that he might be a little paranoid. For some reason, he had been feeling uneasy over the past few days, as though he was being followed. "Perhaps I should hire a team of bodyguards," Eric thought to himself. Soon, he focused his attention on the few people in front of him. "I'm really sorry. Drew always likes to fool around." Eric knocked the little girl on the head before shaking hands with Frank Gehry, Edward Lewis, and the others. At the same time, he nodded at the assistants beside them. "It's okay." Frank Gehry chuckled. Edward Lewis echoed. "Then let's go in. I've been looking at the design plans. After waiting for more than half a year, this place is finally built." Eric's eager look made Frank and the others laugh. "Please follow me," Frank said as he gestured for everyone to get into the car. The manor's door was opened by the temporary guards. The group drove straight to the mansion by the cliff. As for the other buildings in the manor, Eric wasn't in the mood to check them one by one. It was fine as long as they passed the inspection. After all, these buildings were where the manor's staff and guests would live in the future. The few cars drove along a curved cement corridor all the way to the main building on the cliff that Eric called Freedom City. The group got out of the car. Eric looked at the shell-shaped silver building in front of him that was even more exquisite and magnificent than the one in his mind. He couldn't help but exclaim. The Iron Man Malibu mansion in his memory was completely CG, but it was only a concrete building. However, although the building in front of him inevitably used some reinforced concrete, most of the main structure was built with granite, special glass, and low-alloy high-hardness steel. The surface of the spiral shell-shaped building was covered with a silver titanium alloy material that shone brightly under the sun. Originally, Frank Gehry had estimated that the manor's construction budget would only be $5 million. However, with Eric's promise of unlimited funds, Frank Gehry increased the budget again and again like a god shooting a movie. First, it was raised to $10 million, and finally, it was raised to $20 million. At the last moment of completion, he applied for another $2 million budget from Eric. And of the entire manor, 90% of the money was spent on this building. In this day and age, $20 million was enough to build a 20-story building. And now, the housing prices in the entire Malibu City were far from the tens of millions of dollars it would be 20 years later. Most of the villas in Malibu were only worth a few $100,000. Mansions with private beaches and other facilities were only worth a few million. The group of 6 stood outside the silver building for a few minutes, carefully examining the appearance of the entire building. Finally, Frank Gehry said with a smug tone, "Well, I think we should go in and take a look. I believe the internal structure will be even more shocking." The staff opened the door of the villa, and Frank Gehry led the group in. When they walked into the living room, the first thing that attracted everyone's attention was not the spacious living room in front of them, but the sparkling blue sea outside the glass window at the end of the living room. "Wow, it's so beautiful." The men still maintained their restraint and modesty, but the girl didn't care about that. She cheered and jumped toward the floor-to-ceiling window that was more than 10 meters long and more than 2 meters high. Eric, come and take a look." Drew leaned on the glass window without any scruples and looked at the sea outside. Eric didn't go over. Looking at the girl's body leaning on the glass like a little gecko, he asked worriedly, "Mr. Gehry, there shouldn't be a problem with the hardness of the glass, right?" "Of course not," Frank Gehry said confidently. "This is a special glass. Although it looks no different from ordinary glass, this kind of glass actually has 3 layers. In the middle is a layer of polycarbonate material. Even if it gets shot, as long as it's not a large-caliber sniper rifle, it can block it. Of course, if it's shot directly by a gun, it will definitely crack the glass. When that happens, it can only be replaced in one piece. But ordinary impact won't cause any impact at all." When Edward's assistant heard Frank Gehry say that, he said in surprise, "Mr. Gehry, according to what you said, isn't this bulletproof glass? It should be very expensive, right?" Frank Gehry shook his head and said honestly, "Although it's not at the level of bulletproof glass, it's almost there. As for the price, isn't $20 million spent on these things? Eric, shall I give everyone a tour?" "That would be great." When Eric heard Frank Gehry's words, he ignored the girl who was leaning on the glass and looking at the sea view. He followed Frank Gehry to the other parts of the villa. As Frank Gehry walked, he introduced, "This floor is mainly the living room, kitchen, fitness room, and reception room. According to the design drafts you gave us, Eric, the basement is a studio. There are a total of 8 bedrooms on the second and third floors, as well as a storage room, a study, a small screening room, and so on. In addition, there are a total of 12 bathrooms in the villa. Eric nodded gently and walked up the spiral staircase to the second floor. As he listened to Frank Gehry's introduction, he looked around. Then, everyone went to the top floor. It was a spacious master bedroom that allowed them to look around. Through the surrounding glass windows, they could see Malibu City, the distant Santa Monica Mountain, and the sea to the south. It was a 360-degree panoramic view. Looking at the scenery outside the window, Eric suddenly thought of a problem, a very serious problem. "Mr. Gehry, are these glass windows single-sided?" "Of course. How could I miss such an important detail? All the glass windows in this building have been specially treated. Even at night, although you can see light from the outside, it's impossible to see anything inside." "That's good." Eric felt relieved. Otherwise, it would be terrible if someone were to look through the windows with binoculars. After spending more than 10 minutes walking around the entire villa, the group returned to the living room, but the girl was nowhere to be seen. "I believe Miss Barrymore must have gone to the swimming pool outside," Frank Gehry said with a smile. "It just so happens that the scenery there is pretty good. Let's go there to discuss matters." After passing through a side door beside the living room, the few of them came to an open-air swimming pool that faced a cliff. Although the indoor view was also very good, there was a layer of glass after all. There was no obstruction here. Facing the faint sea breeze, looking at the blue sky and white clouds, and the boundless sea surface, they immediately felt like they were in a vast sea. "Mr. Gehry, can I swim now?" The girl's voice came from behind a deck chair. Only then did everyone realize that the girl had found a pair of sunglasses from somewhere and was lying on the deck chair, sunbathing. "Of course, Miss Barrymore." Frank Gehry seemed to like the girl a lot as he said with a chuckle, "But we have to wait for Mr. Williams to sign the project acceptance contract." Chapter 271. From the beginning of the construction of the manor in Malibu, it had attracted a lot of attention. This was because the manor, which occupied 14 acres of land, was not only the largest manor in Malibu, which had just been built independently, but it was also located in such a special geographical location at the tip of Malibu. However, this attention was very limited. It wasn't until the construction of the eye-catching Freedom City on the edge of the cliff was completed that relevant news appeared in some local newspapers in Los Angeles. People were speculating about which tycoon had bought the Freedom City, which was as gorgeous as Malibu's landmark building. However, because the news had been kept secret, everything was just speculation. It wasn't until early December that someone discovered that the youngest director in Hollywood, Eric Williams and Drew Barrymore, began to frequent the manor that the news finally exploded. If the owner of the manor was just an ordinary tycoon, it might not be a big deal. At most, the manor would be discussed by the public for a while. However, if it was a Hollywood director like Eric who had created a series of box office miracles, it meant that it was newsworthy. This was because the public was always curious about the private lives of celebrities. Therefore, when the news of Eric going in and out of the manor in Malibu was exposed, all the information about the manor was dug up by the paparazzi who used all means possible. According to the relevant people involved in the design of Freedom City, the concept draft of Freedom City was originally hand-drawn by Eric Williams. Finally, it was handed over to the famous architect, Frank Gehry, for detailed design. After 7 months of careful construction, it was finally built into a dreamlike mansion that was like a work of art. Eric Williams is indeed a Hollywood director who has created a series of box office miracles. Compared to Oracle CEO Larry Ellison, who is like a nouveau riche in the Middle East, our young director who is not even 20 years old is undoubtedly more tasteful. After investigation, the total cost of the manor in Malibu is close to $30 million. It is more than 5 times the price of the most expensive manor in Malibu. Freedom City, which is located at the edge of the cliff, covers more than 40,000 square feet and has more than 30 rooms. The manor also has a swimming pool, a tennis court, a helipad, and a series of supporting facilities. Although this newspaper didn't get a visit permit from Mr. Eric Williams, it can be seen from the remote aerial photos taken by the hired helicopter that Freedom City is like a gorgeous silver shell on the edge of the cliff. According to the analysis of an architecture professor at the University of California, it was very difficult to build this dreamlike mansion on the edge of the cliff. This alone could cause the construction cost to increase by more than 30%. However, from the looks of it now, it was all worth it. Perhaps many people who come to Malibu in the future will be willing to take a boat out to sea and look at this dreamlike mansion from afar. So far, we've discovered that apart from Drew Barrymore, none of the actresses who are close to Eric Williams, such as Jennifer Aniston, Julia Roberts, and Virginia Madsen, have been in or out of Eric Williams' new manor. Eric Williams has repeatedly claimed to the media that he only treats Drew Barrymore as his sister. As for Eric Williams, it wasn't until the premiere of Home Alone 2-3 weeks ago that he made his first appearance with Jennifer Aniston and personally admitted their relationship. However, according to sources, the relationship between the two is not stable. Therefore, who will become the mistress of the most expensive manor in Malibu undoubtedly leaves us with a lot of suspense. At Disney's headquarters in Burbank, Michael Eisner threw a newspaper with an aerial photo of Freedom City on his desk and muttered a few words with a gloomy expression. Soon, a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. After a while, his assistant knocked on the office door and walked in. "Mr. Eisner, this is the latest information sent by the IMS Detective Company." The assistant placed a few folders in front of Michael Eisner. Michael Eisner opened the folder and first took out a thick stack of photos. He flipped through them one by one. The photos were all intimate photos of Eric and Drew in public. After looking at the photos expressionlessly, Michael Eisner took out a few other documents from the folder. "Have you contacted John Bellymore Jr.?" Michael Eisner looked down at the documents in his hand and asked casually. The assistant gave an affirmative answer. After hesitating for a moment, he said, "Mr. Eisner, I think the key to the matter is still the girl, Drew Bellymore. If she doesn't cooperate, our plan won't have much of an impact on Eric Williams." Michael Eisner didn't even raise his head. He said indifferently, "This isn't something you should be concerned about. You just need to do this according to my instructions." The assistant heard the displeasure in Michael Eisner's tone and quickly nodded. "I understand, Mr. Eisner. You can leave first." Michael Eisner waved his hand at the assistant. After the assistant left the office, Michael Eisner opened the other folders. Although he didn't know that the former president of Columbia, Blunt Cohen, had already used the method of attacking Eric by using the fact that Drew was underage, and it was directly extinguished by Eric before it even started. But Michael Eisner didn't expect this trivial matter to have too much of an impact on Eric. He just wanted to create some trouble for the arrogant young man. Moreover, when that day came, the high-spirited young man would find that he would suddenly face a lot of trouble. Michael Eisner didn't believe that Eric could still hold on and not give in after a series of methods were used. It's not that easy to survive in Hollywood. After reading all the documents, Michael Eisner leaned back in his office chair in a good mood and said softly, "Eric, they're so annoying." In the mansion in Malibu, Drew, who was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window in the living room, pointed to a few speedboats floating on the sea and said, "The sea was originally very beautiful, but now it looks like there are a few pieces of garbage floating on it." Eric, who was sitting on the sofa by the floor-to-ceiling window and reading a book, heard the girl's complaint. He pointed to the party company staff who were preparing for the party in the living room and said helplessly, "You asked for it. You insisted on holding a party. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many paparazzi on the sea." Hearing Eric say this, the girl immediately threw herself at Eric and said coquettishly, "It's such a pity that we don't hold a party in such a beautiful new house. Stop fooling around. Go to your party." Eric pretended to be angry and pulled the girl away from him. The girl inevitably pestered him again. After a while, she left happily. Eric continued to read for a while. He felt a little annoyed by the people walking around in front of him, so he got up and walked to his study. The study was located on the lower floor of the living room, and the structure was completely based on Eric's memory of Tony Stark's studio. Of course, there was no Iron Man armor inside. Instead, it was decorated according to Eric's study in Beverly Hills. The entire wall on the west side of the study had been transformed into a large magnetic white writing board. There were still many manuscripts attached to it with magnets. Eric liked the feeling of many things being displayed in front of his eyes. Bookshelves, filing cabinets, and other furniture were placed in other parts of the study. Of course, there was also the piano. The desk for work was placed by the window, and one could see the sea outside if they looked up. However, at this time, the speedboats on the sea looked like floating garbage, just as the girl had said. Although it was impossible for these people to see the interior of the villa with the most advanced telephoto cameras, they still refused to leave. This was because a few days ago, paparazzi had taken photos of Drew swimming in the pool on the terrace. Eric guessed that these people were waiting for the guests attending the party tonight to come to the terrace so that they could take some useful information. Shrugging helplessly, Eric turned on the fluorescent lights in the study and pressed a button next to the window. Under the window, a baffle of the same color as the studio silently rose. Soon, the baffle merged with the wall, and there was no trace of the window at all. The study also became a completely enclosed space. Satisfied, Eric sat down at the desk and continued to read the book on business management. On the coastal highway, a red car was driving at a moderate speed. Holding the steering wheel, Nicole looked at Jennifer Aniston, who was sitting in the passenger seat. Jennifer Aniston had one arm propped up by the open window and was staring blankly outside. After a while, Nicole finally couldn't help but ask, "Jenny, are you really not going to move there? I've been reading the newspaper these days. That mansion is really beautiful." Jennifer Aniston looked away and shook her head. "No, I can't move there." Nicole, you don't think that I'm annoying you by living with you, right?" Nicole quickly denied. "Of course not. I just don't understand. You are Eric's official girlfriend." After a short silence, Jennifer Aniston said, "I told that guy that there can only be one woman in the house. He also promised me that he would let Drew move out when he was 16. If I compromise now, maybe in 2 years, he won't fulfill his promise." Hearing this, Nicole's lips moved, but she didn't say anything. In her heart, she felt that Jennifer Aniston was too naive. If she didn't grab hold of everything she could now, a lot of things would happen in 2 years. Who knew what would happen then? Because of her experience as a maid in the Beverly Hills villa, Nicole had a deep understanding of Drew's shrewdness. It would be strange if that little girl would be willing to move out in 2 years. Because Drew was similar to her in many ways, Nicole could even imagine what methods that little vixen would use when the time came. Nicole felt that if she were to encounter such a situation, she wouldn't care about anything. Rushing up to snatch the man was the right thing to do. If she dilly-dallied, she would most likely end up empty-handed. Sigh, why couldn't it be her? Thinking of Eric's attitude towards her, Nicole couldn't help but feel a faint resentment. Then, she glanced at Jennifer Aniston with some envy. How was she inferior to this one-track-minded silly girl? Chapter 272. The car drove all the way to the entrance of the manor. The security guard saw the car approaching and was about to come over to check the invitation. When he saw the 2 people in the car, the tall and strong Latino security guard immediately forgot about the invitation. He put on a flattering smile and said to the car window, "Miss Jennifer Aniston, please come in." After he finished speaking, he ran back to the security booth and opened the door. The car drove all the way down the cement corridor to the parking lot. After the 2 women got out of the car, they had the same reaction as Eric when he first saw Freedom City. They stood there and admired the mansion in front of them for a while before walking in side by side. When they opened the door and walked into the mansion, they saw that the hall was more than 600 square meters. The staff in waiters' and chefs' uniforms were busily shuttling back and forth. When they saw the 2 women, they only cast a few curious glances and did not have much of a reaction. The party had not actually started yet. However, as Eric's girlfriend, Jennifer Aniston felt that it was natural for her to arrive early. After waiting at the entrance for a while, Jennifer Aniston was a little angry when she saw that no one paid attention to her. She even forgot about Nicole beside her and walked towards the kitchen in her high heels. After entering, she happened to see a middle-aged man in a suit with his head lowered. He was holding something that looked like a menu in his hand and discussing something with Drew. Jennifer Aniston straightened her back and walked over proudly. She said to the girl, "Hey, how's the preparation? Drew raised his head and glanced at Jennifer Aniston, who was wearing a white dress. He smiled and said, "Madam, you're early. The party hasn't started yet, but you can rest in the living room for an hour." Seeing that Drew treated her like a guest, Jennifer Aniston was furious. She instantly forgot where she was and blurted out, "You little b***tch, don't forget who you are. Be careful or I'll get Eric to kick you out." "I'm so scared." The girl patted her chest with a frightened look. Then, she changed her expression and revealed a sly smile. She said fearlessly, "Go ahead if you can." Jennifer Aniston glared fiercely at Drew, and then her gaze landed on the middle-aged man in a suit. "Are you the person in charge of this party?" The middle-aged man smiled and nodded, as if he didn't hear the two girls arguing. The two girls in front of him were women close to Eric Williams, so he didn't dare to offend either of them. He only politely extended his hand to Jennifer Aniston and said, "Hello, Miss Jennifer Aniston. My name is Will Clark. I'm in charge of planning and organizing this party. Do you have any instructions for me?" "I don't like the position of the buffet table outside," Jennifer Aniston casually made up an excuse. Before Will Clark could react, Drew immediately said, "Mr. Clark, don't forget that I'm the one paying the bill today." Will Clark looked around. As a party planner, he often encountered disputes between different members of the host's family. Usually, under such circumstances, Will Clark would push the matter to the person who had the right to make the decision. And in front of him, the only owner of this manor, and the person who had the most right to speak, was Eric. Therefore, Will Clark quickly said, "I think that if the two ladies have a disagreement, it's best to discuss it with Mr. Williams." Drew and Jennifer Aniston glared at Will Clark at the same time. Will Clark just shrugged and didn't say anything. He looked as if he was saying, "You can do whatever you want, but I won't do it." Helpless, the two girls unwillingly exchanged glances. They knew their limits. With so many people here, the two of them obviously couldn't make a big deal out of the conflict and embarrass Eric. After a moment of stalemate, Jennifer Aniston opened her mouth and said, "Half each." This was the way the two girls often interacted when they were in the Beverly Hills villa. However, this time, the little girl didn't seem to want to compromise. Instead, she said, "Rock, paper, scissors, whoever wins gets to take care of it." Jennifer Aniston clenched her fists as if she remembered something. She immediately shook her head and said, "You little rascal, don't even think about it. Why don't we go look for Eric?" Drew pursed her lips and said, "This time, you're the one who started the dispute. Today, we invited more than 100 guests. If you mess around and embarrass Eric in front of so many people, hee." Hearing Drew's cold snort, Jennifer Aniston clenched her little fists. However, she wasn't Drew. If the two of them were switched, the surly little girl probably wouldn't mind embarrassing Eric a little. However, the good upbringing she had received since young made Jennifer Aniston not dare to do so. In the end, she gave the girl a look that said, "Just wait and see." Only then did Jennifer Aniston ask, "Where's Eric?" Drew shrugged and said without blinking, "I don't know. There are more than 30 rooms here. Go look for him one by one." "You." Jennifer Aniston almost couldn't help but rush up. However, when she saw Will Clark standing beside the two of them with his eyes lowered as if nothing had happened, Jennifer Aniston immediately asked, "Mr. Clark, do you know where Eric is?" Will Clark didn't dare to be as perfunctory as Drew to Jennifer Aniston. However, he smiled bitterly and shook his head. "Miss Jennifer Aniston, I've been in the kitchen all this time. I really don't know." Jennifer Aniston stomped her feet and angrily turned around to leave. Nicole, who was standing in the living room, saw Jennifer Aniston angrily walk to the kitchen. She knew that Jennifer Aniston was going to PK that little vixen Drew. Of course, she wouldn't join in to watch the show. Instead, she looked around the interior of the villa and strolled around leisurely. She sat on an exquisite lounge chair by the floor-to-ceiling window and looked at the sea view outside for a while. After a while, Nicole, who felt a little bored, turned around and walked towards the stairs in the corner of the living room. Just as she was about to walk upstairs, she happened to see a closed door beside her. Out of curiosity, Nicole pressed the button by the door. "What's the matter?" Eric's voice quickly came from the speaker above the button, giving Nicole a fright. Eric, it's me." Nicole didn't know where the microphone was, so she could only speak into the speaker. "Oh, come in," Eric said. A few seconds later, the door opened automatically. Nicole curiously looked at the stairs that led to the next floor before walking in. The door behind her closed automatically without a sound. She walked up the spiral staircase to Eric's study and saw Eric sitting at the desk, reading. She looked around. The layout of this study was similar to the one she saw in Eric's Beverly Hills villa. Nicole walked up to the wall in a few steps. Looking at the densely packed drafts on the wall, she tried to strike up a conversation. "Eric, I didn't think you still haven't changed this habit of yours." Eric put down the book in his hand, opened the window again, and turned off the fluorescent lights in the room. Then, he said to the lady, "Why should I change it? I like it this way." Nicole's hands were behind her back as she wandered around the room. Her high heels made a crisp clicking sound as she walked around the room. Then, she said, "I really envy you. You can do whatever you want." Eric leaned against the desk and looked at the lady. He smiled and said, "As long as a person doesn't always want too much, they can also do whatever they want." "It's not that easy." Nicole shook her head. She walked to Eric's side and sat down on the big desk with her hands slightly propped up. Eric looked at the lady's seemingly casual actions. He raised his eyebrows and asked, "Jenny came with you, right?" Nicole nodded and said with a smile, "Of course. She's just outside. Maybe she's arguing with Miss Barrymore." Eric subconsciously glanced in the direction of the door. Then, he realized that since no one had come to inform him, it meant that the two ladies weren't arguing. Of course, he also believed that the two ladies were people who knew their limits. They could argue in private, but they wouldn't argue in front of so many people. Since that was the case, Eric felt relieved. He sat back down on the leather chair and looked up at Nicole, who was sitting on the desk. The lady was wearing a bright red one-shoulder gown. The slim-fit gown accentuated her perfect figure. There was also a red scarf tied around her neck. Together with her bright red lips and long brown hair that fell to her shoulders, she looked extremely beautiful. Nicole suddenly felt a little uncomfortable when she realized that Eric was sizing her up with that gaze again. At the same time, she also realized that her current posture was inappropriate. She wanted to jump off the desk, but some thoughts in her mind made her stop. Instead, she raised her chin slightly. "Did you pad it with something?" Eric teased after a while. Nicole rolled her eyes at him and said in a slightly provocative tone, "You can try." Jennifer Aniston didn't manage to take the lead from Drew, so she left the kitchen unhappily. However, Nicole was nowhere to be seen. She asked a few staff members, but no one paid attention to the lady's specific whereabouts. Instead, a waiter pointed to the stairs that led upstairs and said, "I just saw Miss Kidman go there. She might have gone upstairs." Jennifer Aniston thanked him and walked up the stairs. Jennifer Aniston also noticed the tightly shut door that led to the next floor. However, she wasn't as curious as Nicole. Instead, she went upstairs directly. After spending a while repeatedly walking around the second and third floors, Jennifer Aniston didn't find Nicole or Eric. Jennifer Aniston gently patted the handrail as she walked down the stairs. However, a strange feeling arose in her heart. This feeling definitely had something to do with Eric and Nicole. Biting her lips, Jennifer Aniston reluctantly turned around and went upstairs to search again. She even knocked on many doors, but there was no response. Returning to the hall, Jennifer Aniston asked the people who were preparing for the party about Eric's whereabouts. "I don't know. Mr. Williams might be in one of the rooms." "Miss Jennifer Aniston, this is our first time here. How would we know?" "I'm sorry, Miss Jennifer Aniston. Perhaps you can go outside and look. The manor is very big. Perhaps Mr. Williams is somewhere else." After asking around, she still couldn't find out about Eric's whereabouts. Jennifer Aniston gloomily kicked the corner of the wall and muttered, "Really, building such a big house just to play hide and seek. Although she was complaining, Jennifer Aniston still walked outside. She couldn't find Eric and Nicole. The uneasiness in her heart grew stronger. However, without seeing it with her own eyes, Jennifer Aniston subconsciously didn't want to think in a certain direction. Although directly asking Drew was the easiest way, unless it was absolutely necessary, Jennifer Aniston was very unwilling to have any dealings with Drew. She was no match for Drew in a verbal battle. She preferred to fight directly because she was a little stronger than the little girl. However, today's occasion was clearly not suitable for a fight. Chapter 273. Drew walked around to check on the preparations for the party. After a while, he realized that Jennifer Aniston was nowhere to be seen. He grabbed a waiter and asked, "Where's Jennifer Aniston?" The waiter, who was holding a tray, recalled and said, "Miss Jennifer Aniston seemed to be looking for Mr. Williams and Miss Kidman, but she couldn't find them in the villa. I saw her go out." "Oh, go ahead." Drew nodded. After the waiter left, the girl rolled her eyes and walked to the entrance of the study. She pressed the button by the door. After a while, Eric's voice was heard. "Who is it?" "Eric, it's Jenny. Open the door." Drew pinched her throat and imitated Jennifer Aniston's voice. In the study, Nicole, who was kneeling in front of the man, heard the voice from the speaker. She raised her head in a panic and looked at Eric, not knowing what to do. Eric was also shocked by the sudden words. Under the stimulation, he couldn't hold it in anymore. He subconsciously held the girl's face so that Nicole couldn't avoid him. He released all of his energy onto the girl's face. After a while, Eric took a deep breath and let go of Nicole. Only then did he realize that Jennifer Aniston and Drew's voices were very different. Therefore, the girl's imitating of Jennifer Aniston's voice was completely different. Eric gave the embarrassed Nicole a reassuring look and handed the tissue box on the table to the girl. Then, he picked up the phone on the table and said, "Drew, don't mess around." The girl, who was leaning against the door, giggled. "Eric, don't tell me you were so scared that you did that?" Eric snorted. Drew pretended not to hear him and said with a smile, "Let me remind you, Jennifer is looking for the two of you." After Drew said that, she didn't wait for Eric's reply and hung up the phone. Eric put down the phone and pointed to the bathroom door behind him. "Go take a shower. You'll come out later. Just say that you're reading here. I'll leave first." Nicole wiped her face with a tissue and nodded silently. Eric quickly tidied up and left the study. After returning to his bedroom and taking a quick shower, Eric changed into a new set of clothes and walked out of the villa. After searching for a while, he finally saw Jennifer Aniston sitting on the bench by the tennis court. When she saw Eric walking over alone, the originally unhappy Jennifer Aniston's expression finally showed a relieved expression. Although he was a little apologetic, Eric still used the excuse that he just went out to avoid this matter. He knew that the girl would definitely not like to hear the truth, and he would not be stupid enough to tell the truth. As the night came, the party also began. The guest list was all arranged by Drew. Eric couldn't be bothered to intervene in this matter. Other than many people that Eric was familiar with, there were also neighbors near the sharp corners of Malibu that were invited according to the usual practice. In addition to the male and female companions that these guests brought, there were close to 200 people in total. At this time, Eric was dealing with an evil neighbor. The reason why he labeled the other party as such when they first met was that the other party was really not very likable. As soon as they met, the other party pestered him to buy the mansion. "Eric, 35 million, how about 35 million, sell the manor to me, I promise to pay in one lump sum." In the face of Eric's refusal, the middle-aged man with a beard raised the price again. Eric had a helpless look on his face as he said, "Mr. Ellison, I've already said this many times. I will never sell this manor. 37 million, this money is 10 million more than the cost of your entire manor." "Eric, think about it again." Larry Ellison persistently raised the price again with a hint of fanaticism in his expression. During this period of time, Larry Ellison saw the information about Free City in the newspaper. The extravagant Larry Ellison, who liked to collect mansions, immediately fell in love with the majestic Free City on the edge of the cliff. In comparison, he felt that the mansions he bought in Malibu were so unbearable that he had the urge to tear them down. The arrogant Larry Ellison thought that he was the only one who deserved to own such a luxurious house. Therefore, as a neighbor who received the party invitation, Larry Ellison directly pestered Eric after arriving at the manor. The price increased from $27 million to $37 million US. As usual, he tried to use money to get what he wanted. However, the arrogant Larry Ellison ignored a fact. Although Eric's wealth was not as good as his, he was not short of money. What's more, Eric's love for this mansion was not much less than Larry Ellison's. Looking at Larry Ellison's stubborn look, Eric had to suggest, "How about this, Mr. Ellison, you contact Mr. Frank Gehry. I can license the design of this mansion to you for free. You can find a place to build another one." Larry Ellison immediately shook his head and said, "Of course, such a mansion has to be unique. Besides, where else can I find a place like Malibu Point? God, why didn't I think of it before? I should have bought this place earlier." "Eric, how about this? I have a total of 16 mansions in Malibu. I'll trade all of them with you. What do you think?" Eric opened his mouth in surprise. With Larry Ellison's identity as the CEO of Oracle, the mansions he mentioned would definitely not be less than $1 million US. The total price of 16 mansions could reach $40 to $50 million US. However, Eric still shook his head without thinking. "Mr. Ellison, no matter what, I won't sell this mansion today. So, please don't talk about this anymore. Also, I have to go entertain other guests. Sorry." Seeing that Eric was about to leave impatiently, Larry Ellison continued, "Then, Eric, no matter when you want to sell, please contact me immediately." "Okay, I promise. As long as I have the intention to sell, I'll definitely contact you, Mr. Ellison." With that, Eric walked towards Robert Shea, who was accompanied by an Asian man in his 50s. "Hey, Eric, this place is great. I can't help but feel tempted." Robert Shea smiled and hugged Eric. Eric let go of Robert Shea and said, "Larry Ellison has been pestering me for more than 10 minutes. Robert, don't tell me you want to buy this mansion too? If you dare to open your mouth, I'll call the security to send you away." Robert Shea laughed and said, "Of course not. How can I be so tactless? All right, let me introduce you. This is Mr. Raymond Zhou from Hong Kong, across the ocean." Eric had already recognized this man. Although he looked much younger than when he first saw him on the media in his previous life, he did not change much. After sizing him up, Eric extended his hand and said, "Hello, Mr. Zhou. I'm Eric Williams." Chapter 274. "Hello, Mr. Williams." Although Raymond Zhou wanted to appear neither servile nor overbearing, there was inevitably a hint of eagerness in his expression. "Mr. Williams, I've seen your Dark Battle. To be honest, the style of this movie is very similar to some of our Hong Kong movies. Coincidentally, the Hong Kong release of Dark Battle was handled by Jaha, and the box office sales were very good. Actually, I've always liked Hong Kong movies," Eric said with a smile. "For example, Bruce Lee's movies, Elite Martial School, Brother Tongshen, Fierce Dragon Crossing the River, Battle Between the Dragon and the Tiger, and that half of Game of Death." What a pity. In the end, Eric shook his head regretfully. When Raymond Zhou heard Eric's sudden words, a look of reminiscence appeared on his face. He shook his head and sighed. "It's indeed a pity. Sigh, it's been more than 10 years. I still remember the first time I worked with Bruce." After saying that, Raymond Zhou suddenly raised his head and looked at Eric. He asked curiously, "Mr. Williams, I remember that you're only 19 years old this year. When Bruce passed away, you were only 3 years old. Good movies will never go out of style. I only saw the videotapes of Bruce's movies after I grew up. Speaking of which, when I was filming in Seattle last time, I specially went to Mr. Bruce Lee's grave. Although it's been more than 10 years, fans from all over the world often go there to offer flowers." Raymond Zhou was stunned, and a faint trace of shame flashed across his face. If it weren't for Bruce Lee, he might not have achieved what he had today. However, other than when Bruce Lee was buried, he had not been to Seattle many times. After I'm done with my business, I'll also go to Seattle to pay my respects. Eric nodded non-committally, then looked at Robert Shea, who had been silent all this time. He still didn't know why Robert had introduced him to him. Robert pulled Eric to the side and said in a low voice, "It's like this. Last year, I participated in a movie that Hong Kong Jiahe invested in called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. You should have heard of it, right?" Originally, Fox agreed to release this movie, but after watching the finished product, Fox backed out. When Eric heard the words, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, he quickly remembered the movie. Although he wasn't too familiar with the movie in the United States in his previous life, he knew a bit about the history of Hong Kong movies. It was said that the head of Jiahe, Mr. Zhou, had always wanted to enter Hollywood. After a few small squabbles, Jiahe bought the rights to adapt Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and planned to play it big this time. Jiahe invested 80 million Hong Kong dollars in this movie and eventually made 1 billion Hong Kong dollars in North America. According to the exchange rate, 1 billion Hong Kong dollars was equivalent to almost 130 million US dollars. It was impossible for a foreign company to take more than 100 million US dollars from Hollywood. Then, this sum of money would definitely only be the North American box office earnings of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. However, a box office earnings of more than 100 million in North America was enough to squeeze into the top 10 of the current box office rankings. And Fox actually gave up on such a movie that was enough to squeeze into the box office rankings. It sounded really interesting. However, in his memory, Fox had always liked to do this kind of thing. In his previous life, Fox gave up on the North American distribution of Titanic and sold it to Paramount for a low price of 60 million US dollars. In the end, Titanic grossed more than 600 million US dollars in North America. Although Fox had experienced this once, they did not learn their lesson. 10 years later, they continued to work harder. The next movie was Cocker's Avatar. Fox was worried about the investment risk, so they brought in other investors. In the end, Avatar was a box office hit, and Fox lost another few hundred million USD because of this wrong decision. Shaking his head to get rid of these messy thoughts, Eric asked, "Robert, what do you think?" Robert Shea said, "It's like this, Eric. A total of 13 million US dollars was invested in this movie. This is not a small sum. New Line also invested 3 million US dollars. Now that Fox is not willing to release it, we can only do it ourselves. You have such good taste in movies, so I discussed with Raymond Zhou and wanted you to help take a look at the finished movie and give us some ideas." "Did you bring the copy?" Eric asked. Robert Shea was stunned and shook his head. "No, I just brought Mr. Zhou here to get to know you and mention this matter. We can go to the company tomorrow to take a look." Eric also realized that he had been too impatient. Although there was a small screening room in the mansion, even if Robert had brought the copy, he couldn't leave the 200 guests in the hall alone. That would be too impolite. "Okay then, go to the company tomorrow morning. We can take a look together." "Okay, that's it," Robert said and pointed not far away. "I saw an old friend. I'll go and say hello." "Sure, have fun," Eric said with a smile. Seeing Robert leave, Eric realized that Mr. Zhou did not leave with him. "Mr. Zhou, is there anything else?" "No, Mr. Williams, you just said that you like Hong Kong movies very much. What do you think of Hong Kong movies?" Mr. Zhou casually found a topic to talk about. Eric brought him to the buffet table and took some food. The two of them came to the sofa near the floor-to-ceiling window. Seeing Eric come over, the man and woman who were originally sitting on the sofa took the initiative to give up their seats. The two of them sat down together, and Eric said, "Mr. Zhou, I think the development of Hong Kong movies has completely lost its rationality. It gives people a feeling of the last madness before it collapses." Mr. Zhou originally just wanted to talk to Eric about some excellent Hong Kong movies and get closer to him. It would be best if they could work together. He did not expect to hear Eric talk about the current situation of Hong Kong movies. Mr. Zhou smiled bitterly and said helplessly, "Everyone is making money like crazy. Who would think so much about it? But Mr. Williams, as an outsider, you see it very clearly. Since this is the case, Mr. Williams, do you have any ideas to solve this problem? What ideas could Eric have? He was just casually talking about it based on his impression from his previous life. Even if there was, it would not be useful now. At least 20 years later, when China completely opened its own movie market. But at that time, the concept of Hong Kong movies would not exist. Because of all kinds of restrictions, the future of Hong Kong movies was almost doomed. Eric said, although I also like a lot of Hong Kong movies, I can't do anything about this situation. Raymond sighed and looked at Eric. He asked tentatively, then, Mr. Williams, do you think there is a possibility of us working together? Chapter 275. Cooperation. Hearing this question, Eric thought for a while and shook his head. Although he had another soul in his heart, he didn't feel any obligation to help Hong Kong movies enter Hollywood. Moreover, there weren't many examples of successful cooperation between Hollywood and Hong Kong movies. In his memory, there was only the Rush Hour series that could be considered a success. However, this movie was obviously not suitable to be presented now. In his previous life, Jack Chang launched the Rush Hour series after several movies had paved the way for him to make a name for himself in Hollywood. He was lucky enough to find a Western audience and was successful. Although Jack Chang was now very popular in Asia, he was not very famous in Hollywood. Inviting him to star in Rush Hour was not much different from finding a Hollywood Chinese action actor, but his salary in US dollars was almost the same as that of an A-list Hollywood star. Mr. Zhou, I don't think it's a good time to cooperate now. I know a little about the history of your film company. The star of Golden Harvest, Mr. Jack Chang, tried to enter Hollywood in the early 1980s, but failed several times. I don't think he will easily abandon his status and career in Hong Kong and come to Hollywood, right? Mr. Zhou pondered Eric's words and his eyes showed disappointment and helplessness. Eric was right. Hong Kong movies were now in an explosive period. Jack Chang had learned his lesson from his previous failures. It was impossible for him to easily agree to come to Hollywood again. Other than Jack Chang, he couldn't bring out any other actors. After all, only Chinese kung fu could attract Hollywood's interest. Even the big-budget Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles this time was actually under the guise of kung fu. The 4 Ninja Turtles in the movie were all played by Hong Kong martial artists. That's a pity, Mr. Zhou shook his head and said. Although he had some thoughts of investing in Eric's movie, the young man in front of him was the director of several of the best-selling movies in Hollywood this year. There were countless people in Hollywood who wanted to invest in his movie. It was impossible for an outsider like Golden Harvest to get a share of the profits. After finishing the food in front of him, Eric said goodbye to Mr. Zhou and got up to leave. After taking a few steps, a tall woman in a black dress walked towards Eric with a glass of red wine. It seemed to be the same old trick. How uncreative. Eric smiled helplessly. He turned his body slightly and reached out to grab the wrist of the girl's hand that was holding the red wine. His other hand took the red wine from the other party's hand and raised it to the girl with a slightly red face. Miss, thank you for the red wine. The woman saw that her intentions were seen through. Although she was a little embarrassed, she immediately seized the opportunity and said, You're welcome, Mr. Williams. My name is... Just as the woman was about to introduce herself, Eric stuck out a finger and pressed it against her red lips. He looked straight into the woman's slightly widened eyes and said, Miss, I've heard a very philosophical saying before. It's called, why should we have known each other when we met? So, can you not say your name? When Eric withdrew his finger, the girl nodded. All right, Mr. Williams, would you like to dance with me? Eric shook his head. I'm sorry, miss. I'm a little tired. The girl did not dare to pester him too much. She turned around and walked away in disappointment. Eric was also about to leave when a slightly teasing voice sounded in his ear. Why should we have known each other when we meet? Eric, then why did you leave me in the office when we first met? Because we are fated to meet thousands of miles apart. Eric turned around and looked at Nicole beside him with a smile. At this time, the girl looked cold and aloof. Seeing Eric glancing at her face, Nicole glared at Eric but did not say anything. Eric shrugged indifferently and said, "As you wish, Nicole. You have to know that I'm a very protective person." Nicole bit her lips angrily. She recalled the scene in the study where Eric tightly held her head and did not let her dodge. When she heard Eric's words, she almost could not help but splash the red wine in her hand on Eric's face. "You're really too shameless. I love it when women praise me like this." Eric chuckled. "Miss Kidman, can I dance with you?" Nicole hesitated for a moment but still put her little hand in Eric's. When the man pulled her to the dance floor, Nicole could not help but ask, "Why did you reject that Miss Nameless?" "That's not like you." "Because I don't like her eyebrows." "Do you accept this reason?" Eric said on the dance floor as he hugged the girl's waist. Nicole followed the man's strength and leaned her body closer to Eric. She retorted, "Bullsh*T. I think you're worried that Jenny is here." "What about you? You're so close to me. Aren't you afraid that Jenny will think of something if she sees you?" "Of course not, because Jenny went outside." Although Nicole said so, she could not help but look around to make sure that Jennifer Aniston was not nearby. Only then did she feel relieved. Seeing Nicole's reaction, Eric smirked again. "Nicole, don't you think that our conversation just now was very similar to that? You're so shameless." "Hey, you're praising me again. That's not good. Men can't take compliments. Why don't we go to my study again?" Nicole threatened Eric. "As long as you're not afraid of being seen by others, I don't have any opinions at all. But if we're exposed, I'll blatantly snatch Jenny's man away." "Wow, then forget it." Eric seemed to have thought of something terrible and pretended to shudder. The lively party only ended at midnight. Eric used the master bedroom that had a 360-degree view of the scenery of Malibu to seduce Jennifer Aniston. In the end, Jennifer Aniston reluctantly stayed. The next day, Eric went to watch Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles with Robert Shea and Mr. Zhou from Hong Kong in the morning. To be honest, because Eric had experienced the baptism of countless special effects blockbusters in his previous life, when he saw Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, he could not help but have the urge to get up and leave several times. However, since he already knew the results of the box office, it was too easy to find the merits of the movie. Therefore, after watching it, Eric suppressed the discomfort in his heart and praised the movie fiercely, so that Robert could rest assured and focus on the release of the movie. After all, no one would go against money. After receiving Eric's affirmation, Robert Shea set the release date of the movie for next year's Easter. Although this schedule was not as good as the summer, it was still quite good. Besides, the summer would definitely be reserved for his own movie. Although he had invested in the new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, it was still not his own. After discussing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Eric had just left the screening room when he saw Alan waiting outside. Seeing Eric come out, Alan walked up and said, "Eric, Disney's CEO Frank Wales and Fox's CEO William Bell are waiting for you." "Did they come together? Did they say anything?" Eric asked, puzzled. Alan shook his head. "They didn't come together, and they didn't say why they were looking for you." Eric looked at his watch and said, "Then let's go." When he came to his office, Eric saw two middle-aged men sitting in the lounge chatting, so he went up to them. After exchanging greetings, Eric invited the two of them to his office, but Frank Wales and William Bell looked at each other and had no intention of going together. Eric realized that the two of them had different reasons for looking for him. He looked around and suggested, "Why don't you rest here for a while, Mr. Bell?" "No problem, Eric. I don't have anything to do in the morning anyway," William Bell said and sat back on the sofa. After bringing Frank Wales into the office, Eric asked him why he was here. "It's like this, Eric. Didn't you promise Disney the distribution rights for a movie? Mr. Eisner asked me to discuss this matter and sign the distribution contract. This way, Disney can also include the distribution plan for this movie into next year's work." Eric thought for a moment and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Wales. I haven't decided what movie I'm going to shoot next year, so how about after the new year? Don't worry, the cooperation between Island Horror and Steel Magnolias was very pleasant. I promised to give Disney the distribution rights for a movie. Frank Wales remembered Michael Eisner's instructions when he came and continued, Eric, actually, this works too. Can we sign a contract of intent first? You don't need to provide a specific movie plan, as long as you can ensure that you give Disney a movie next year. Just like the 3 movie contracts you gave to Fox last year. I remember that you didn't discuss the content of the other 2 movies with Fox in advance, right? Eric spread his hands and said, Frank, you have to know that Firefly isn't the small workshop it was a year ago, so I can't promise you so hastily. Many things need to be planned. Since you mentioned my contract with Fox last year, you must know about the disturbance during that period. So, wait for me to finalize the plan for next year in detail and decide what to shoot. Then, I promise to sign the contract with Disney. Frank Wales said a few more words, but seeing that Eric didn't agree, he could only leave in disappointment. Very few people knew about the matter discussed by the 6 CEOs in Malibu so far. In order to ensure that the secret wasn't leaked, other than the 6 CEOs, there were only a few people directly in charge of the execution. Michael Eisner didn't tell Frank Wales about this matter, so Frank Wales felt that the reason given by Eric was enough to explain to Michael Eisner. Chapter 276. After sending Frank Wales off, Eric welcomed the president of Fox, William Bell, into his office. William, how's Fox's performance these days? Eric sat down on the sofa in the office. He was not in a hurry to ask William Bell's intentions. Instead, he talked about the current situation of Fox. Hearing this question, William Bell was slightly excited. Although the head of Fox was Barry Diller, as the second in command, Fox's development was very strong during this period of time because of Friends. Therefore, William Bell had been very proud of himself for the past few months. Originally, he felt that he could not raise his head when facing the general managers of the 3 major television stations. Now, even when facing the chairman of the 3 major television stations, William Bell was not at a disadvantage at all. Very good, Eric. A few days ago, the first season finale of Friends had a viewership of 28 million, and the average viewership of the first season has reached 23 million. There is no doubt that it will be this year's TV series viewership champion. Even though Friends has already ended, Fox's fixed viewership is still around 11 million viewers. Alright, we also have an animated series that's doing very well. It's called The Simpsons, and it has an average viewership of 13 million. The company has already renewed it for a second season. Eric listened patiently and nodded from time to time. When William Bell finished speaking, Eric asked, So, William, why did you call me here today? William Bell said, It's about the X-Files and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Mr. Diller wants to start the production of these 2 shows as soon as possible. By the way, Eric, I remember that the original plan was to produce the first episode of the X-Files this month. Why hasn't there been any news yet? Eric also had a helpless look on his face. Although this was his original plan, plans could never keep up with changes. Because of the importance that Firefly and Fox placed on the X-Files, the 2 producers sent by the 2 companies would have disagreements in many aspects. Often, they would have to come to Eric to make a decision. Therefore, the progress of the preparation was delayed. In addition, although the male lead of the X-Files had been confirmed, there was still no clue about the female lead. It would be good enough if they could start filming in January next year. However, Eric was not in a hurry. It just so happened that Firefly's finances at the end of the year were starting to be a little tight. Therefore, it was a good idea to wait for the profits from Dark War and Friends before starting the production of the X-Files. As for Who Will Become a Millionaire? This show was quite simple, so Eric was not in a hurry. Moreover, there was still the problem of funding. Although this show was very simple, it still required a few million investment, half of which was provided by Firefly. Because of Cisco's matter, Eric had transferred the initial $10 million to the account of the investment company chaired by Chris Hansen. Now, The joint activity funds of Firefly and New Line did not exceed $10 million. The release of the videotape of Golden Jade League and Smelling Women required this money. Therefore, everything had to wait until the $117 million from Dark War and Friends was received at the end of the month. Eric did not avoid it and told William Bell about his difficulties. Then he said, "William, you see, Firefly is out of money now, so we can't invest the funds on our side in time. Moreover, The X-Files will premiere in September next year. There is plenty of time now. As for Who Will Become a Millionaire, it will definitely be launched together with the TV series in the spring in March. 1 month of preparation and promotion for this show is enough." But Eric's words were reasonable. Moreover, the other party had the identity of a boss. William Bell did not know what to say. He did not even understand why Barry Diller had asked him to come over, and why his tone was so urgent. "Eric, to be honest, it was Mr. Diller who asked me to come this time." William Bell looked as if he was confiding in him. "I think it might be because the broadcast of Friends was snatched away by the 3 major TV stations. Mr. Diller is worried that there will be a change in the situation." Eric shook his head and smiled. "This worry is completely unnecessary. William, Firefly now has 10% of Fox's shares. How can I not be in a position to give the show to others? Besides, we have already signed the contract. What are you worried about?" William Bell actually thought the same in his heart. In the end, he could only say, "Eric, why don't you call Mr. Diller and explain it to him personally? Otherwise, I can't go back and explain it to him." Okay, I'll call him now." Eric shrugged helplessly. He even felt some sympathy for this cautious president. To be honest, although he worked for a movie and television giant like Fox, having a strong boss suppressing him was indeed a very cowardly thing. Eric guessed that Frank Wales, the president of Disney who had just left, was in a similar situation as William Bell. Michael Eisner and Barry Diller were both very strong people. When Barry Diller received Eric's call, his tone was obviously surprised. After hearing what Eric said, Barry Diller on the other end of the phone realized that he might have made a mistake. However, since it had already happened, he had to agree with Eric as if nothing had happened. Finally, he urged Eric with concern to prepare for The X-Files as soon as possible before hanging up. After sending off the relieved William Bell, it was already 10 o'clock in the morning. Alan knocked on the office door and walked in. Seeing Eric leaning on the office chair as if he was thinking about something, Alan said softly, "Eric, the audition at the Fox set must have already started. Do you still want to participate?" Eric shook his head, but immediately nodded and said, "I'd better go. By the way, Alan, do you feel that today's matter is a little strange?" "In what way?" Alan asked as he followed Eric out of the office. Eric rubbed his forehead and said, "Maybe it's because I've been too tired recently and my nerves are tense. However, I keep feeling that there's something wrong." Alan paused and suggested, "Why don't you go back and rest for a day, Eric?" "No need." Eric shook his head and said, "If we can directly choose the female lead, we can even skip the 3rd round of interviews. Anyway, we've been tormented for so many days." The two of them went to the parking lot in silence. The company's driver greeted Eric and ran down to open the car door for Eric eagerly. Eric thanked him and just got into the car. Suddenly he shrank back and raised his voice and said, "I've got it." Alan and the driver both looked at Eric strangely. Eric also realized that he had lost his composure and said, "Let's talk in the car." After the car started, Eric told his assistant, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, about the purpose of the two CEOs' visit. Then he said, "Alan, did you notice that they seemed a little too eager to come here together today?" "Eagerly?" Alan pondered for a moment and said with a smile, "If this kind of thing happened to me, I would be anxious too. Eric, I think you still need to rest." Eric shrugged and did not speak again. However, the feeling in his heart still did not dissipate, but he still could not understand what was going on. When Eric arrived at the Fox set, the audition in a small studio had already begun. Eric directly pushed the door open and walked into the audition room. The The seat in the center of the long judge's table was empty. Eric greeted everyone and sat down in the middle seat without hesitation. "Miss, please continue." After sitting in the chair, an assistant handed him the audition information. Eric then nodded to the girl standing in the middle of the room, who was a little overwhelmed by his sudden arrival. The woman paused and continued to perform a somewhat jerky performance. Although there were many people auditioning, the audition did not go fast. There were only 7 or 8 people in an hour. Another woman with a somewhat tough face walked out of the room and sat on Eric's left. David Greenwalt, the producer from Fox, said, "This actress named Sharon Stone is very good. Not only does she have enough acting experience, but her appearance also meets the requirements of the female lead, Dana Scarlett." After David finished speaking, he looked at Eric on his right, but he saw Eric absent-mindedly writing on the paper with his head down. When Sharon Stone walked in, David noticed that Eric was a little absent-minded. Not only did he not ask a question, but he also did not watch the other party's performance. The man on Eric's right was Hans Whittle. He had participated in the production of the Cocoon series, so he was poached to be the producer of the X-Files series. Seeing that Eric did not say anything, Hans curiously glanced at the paper that Eric was writing on. "Instinctive, what does that mean?" Hans Whittle asked curiously. Eric looked up and saw that both of them were staring at him. He explained, "It's nothing. I just thought of a good script, so I was a little distracted." The two producers were a little surprised and impressed. They did not expect Eric to be able to come up with a script in such a situation. However, they did not forget what they were doing. After a few teasing words, Hans asked, "Eric, what do you think of Sharon Stone just now?" Eric shook his head. "No." David Greenwalt was unwilling to give up and asked, "Eric, I think Sharon Stone completely meets your requirements. Her acting skills are good, her age is suitable, and her temperament matches your setting. Why not? Why don't we put her in the 3rd round?" Chapter 277. Eric handed the rough script outline of Basic Instinct to Alan, who was behind him, and instructed his assistant to register the outline at the Writers' Guild. Then he said to David Greenwalt, "Because I don't like this woman." The two producers were speechless at the same time. This reason was too powerful. David Greenwalt and Hans Whittle felt helpless and envious at the same time. They wondered when they could reach the point where they could control the fate of others with just a word of, "I don't like her." Eric had no intention of explaining to the two. He was not an extreme nationalist, and he would not boycott someone just because they said a few anti-XTH words. "If you don't like me, then I don't like you either. That's all. We're all ordinary people. There's no need to worry so much." However, in his previous life, a woman who could laugh and say the word retribution after the disaster that killed tens of thousands of innocent civilians could only be described as cold-blooded. No matter what bull**T reason she used to defend herself, it was hard to forgive her. Therefore, the moment he saw Sharon Stone's information, Eric directly passed her over. He also took advantage of the audition to write out the script outline of Basic Instinct, which made Sharon Stone famous. After all, it was a movie with a box office of over 100 million. Although with Eric's current fame, for the sake of his image, it was impossible for him to personally produce such a controversial and large-scale movie. He did not even intend to use his real name as the screenwriter when he produced the movie in the future. But this script was handed over to Robert Shea. Anyway, Robert Shea was going to direct 2 big-budget movies this year. As long as it was profitable, Robert would definitely be willing to produce any movie. As for the female lead of a TV series could attract hundreds of people to fight over it. Would Hollywood be short of female leads? Eric's imagination ran wild. Another poor girl was ignored by him. The next woman walked in. Eric looked up at her, then opened her information and looked at the name on it. After confirming that he did not recognize the wrong person, Eric looked up with a strange smile. "Miss, have we met before?" Hans Whittle and David Greenwalt, who originally thought that Eric would continue to be distracted, shut their mouths in unison. It seemed that the female lead had been found. Finally, they didn't have to endure for a few more days. Although they could see nearly 100 beautiful faces every day, they definitely wouldn't feel anything after seeing too many of them. Moreover, with Eric at the top, they didn't have the right to decide. They could only look at these beautiful women but couldn't touch them. Although Famke Janssen, who had just sat down, felt that Eric was looking at him strangely, he was delighted. Being noticed was better than being ignored. Mr. Williams, perhaps you've seen my advertisements in some fashion magazines. I've shot quite a few advertisements. Eric unabashedly glanced at the girl's long legs that were tightly wrapped in white casual pants and asked, "Miss Johnson, are you a model?" Famke Janssen shook his head. "Not anymore. I just retired." Eric revealed a non-committal expression and then asked, "Then, if this audition fails, what will you do in the future?" Famke Janssen's expression didn't change much. After some thought, he said, "If that's the case, I might apply for a university and study for 2 years. After getting a certificate, I can find other jobs." "What about other jobs, such as?" Famke Janssen was taken aback. He quickly shook his head and said, "I don't know. I haven't thought about it yet." Eric nodded and said to the 2 producers beside him, "I have no more questions. You can do it. Aren't you going to ask a few more questions, such as if you have a boyfriend?" Hans Whittle came over and whispered a joke. Eric rolled his eyes at him. He thought to himself, "So what if the girl I like has a boyfriend? I can just snatch her away." "Eric, is she the one?" David Greenwald also whispered. Eric nodded slightly, but said, "Let's finish this morning's audition first." To be honest, there weren't many famous actresses born in the 60s who caught up with Hollywood's rise in the world. There were only 20 or 30 who could enter the A-list. There were also a few who stepped on the first bus after the 70s to make up the numbers. And Famke Janssen was one of the more famous Hollywood actresses born in the 60s. The girl who left the deepest impression on Eric wasn't the only level 5 mutant in X-Men, Phoenix, but the valiant and beautiful Russian assassin in 007 The Golden Eye. Famke Janssen saw the 3 main judges whispering and felt a little uneasy. He didn't know what they were discussing. But what happened next made him happy. The 3 of them were especially meticulous about her audition. Other auditionees usually didn't take more than 10 minutes, but her audition took a full 20 minutes. After Famke Janssen left, David Greenwald said, "Not bad. Her acting is a little clumsy, but it'll be fine with more practice during the shooting. She has a strong sense of the camera, as expected of a model." Hans Whittle chimed in with a grin. Eric didn't care about the 2 people's envious and teasing expressions. He filled in his own opinions on the form in front of him. The morning audition passed quickly. Since the roles had been decided, there was no need for everyone to be busy. Eric packed up his things, said a few words, and left with Erin. As for Famke Janssen, he wasn't in a hurry. He would talk about it after he was done with his work. It was the end of December, and Christmas was just around the corner. In the 5 weeks since Thanksgiving Day on November 17th, The Kid in Charge 2 was basically leading the North American box office. In just 5 weeks, The Kid in Charge 2's box office had reached $110 million. In the top 5 of the North American box office rankings, other than Home Alone 2, Warner's Lethal Weapon 2, and Universal's Back to the Future 2, occupied the top 3 spots in the box office rankings. Island Horror and Steel Magnolias repeatedly competed for the 4th spot, steadily earning more than $10 million in box office sales every week. After 7 weeks of accumulation, The Small Island's box office was about to break through $100 million. The final box office could exceed the original target of $150 million. Because The Small Island's box office had hardly dropped by more than 20% in the past few weeks, and Steel Magnolia's box office trend was more stable, accumulating more than $60 million in 5 weeks. In addition, the movie's theme was very suitable for the Christmas atmosphere. It was estimated that there would be a box office rebound during the Christmas period. There was no doubt that the total box office would break through $100 million before the next release. As for the black comedy Harlem Nightclub, starring Eddie Murphy, after its release, although it had a good box office in the first week, it experienced a drop of more than 50% in the next 2 weeks in a row. Its ranking directly fell out of the top 5, once again proving the truth that black movies couldn't squeeze into the mainstream of Hollywood. The outstanding results of The Kid 2, The Small Island, and Steel Magnolias could not attract the attention of the media. Since the beginning of November, the movies produced by Firefly or Eric began to dominate the box office rankings. So far, they had occupied the position for 7 weeks. On December 22nd, Sleepless in Seattle was about to be released. This was another movie directed by Eric. Under Fox's strong promotion, basically no one was optimistic about the Crazy Christmas Vacation, which was released by Warner to compete with Sleepless in Seattle. As the 7th week passed, December 22nd finally arrived. After the premiere at the China Grand Theater in Los Angeles, Sleepless in Seattle was officially released in more than 2,200 theaters in North America. At the same time, Al Pacino's Knowing Women by Smelling the Fragrance was released. Robert Shaye followed the release schedule of many Oscars films and only arranged 60 premiere theaters for Knowing Women by Smelling the Fragrance to gain admission to the Oscars. After the female lead of The X-Files was confirmed, Eric's work for the year was basically completed. After attending the premiere of Sleepless in Seattle, he stayed in his Malibu mansion to rest. Every day, he read books and wrote scripts. His life was very relaxed. Compared with Eric's relaxed and comfortable life, the entire North American media was nervously paying attention to the box office of Sleepless in Seattle in the first week. Because if Sleepless in Seattle could successfully win the box office this week, then Eric's movie would really achieve the grand slam of the box office for the entire New Year's 8 weeks. Although many media outlets were not optimistic about Crazy Christmas Vacation, which Warner used to fight, no one dared to guarantee that the movie would create a box office miracle like Home Alone. After all, although the movie was not starring a child, the style was similar to Home Alone. In this anxious wait, the 3-day box office for the first weekend was released. Sleepless in Seattle undoubtedly won the box office for the 3-day weekend with a box office of $17 million, while Crazy Christmas Vacation only had a box office of more than $11 million, which was not even as much as Home Alone 2, which had a box office increase because of Christmas. As soon as the news came out, the last slightly suspenseful result was also decided. A week later, Sleepless in Seattle received more than $27 million in the first week's box office, and Home Alone 2 took the top spot on the box office chart. At this point, through the relay of 3 movies, Firefly successfully won the box office of the entire New Year's box office. The media began to spontaneously hype this matter. Although the first Home Alone last year won the box office for 10 weeks, the box office of that movie could only be classified as a miracle. This year, Firefly won the box office for 8 consecutive weeks during the new year through this relay method, which was the true manifestation of hard strength. Although Firefly only released Smell a Woman, and the other movies were released by Disney and Fox, few media outlets in North America credited this result to Disney or Fox. Most media outlets were amazed at the series of box office miracles achieved by Eric's movies, and at the same time ridiculed the lackluster box office results of the 7 major film companies. It had to be said that while Sleepless in Seattle won the box office, several other things happened at the same time. The first was Smell a Woman. Although there were only 60 cinemas for the movie's premiere, it got a box office of more than $900,000 in the first week. The average weekly box office per cinema was more than $15,000. Such a result far exceeded the threshold of a blockbuster movie of $10,000. Moreover, the reputation of the movie was also very good. Film critics evaluated the role of the blind lieutenant colonel played by Al Pacino as the most classic role since he started acting. Another thing was about the videotape of Golden Jade League. After the release of Sleepless in Seattle, with the cooperation of Firefly and the two-pronged promotion, the videotape sales of Golden Jade League exceeded 200,000 units in the first week and reached the top 10 of the weekly videotape sales. This was an old movie from more than 30 years ago. If 200,000 boxes were sold in the first week, then it was not a problem for the following sales to break through 1 million boxes, or even reach 2 million boxes. Eric remembered that after Seattle, in his previous life, the videotape sales of Golden Jade League had reached 2 million boxes. According to the cost of less than $10 per box of videotape, excluding the $5 profit to distributors, Firefly could get half of the profit from each box of videotape sold at about $30. If the sales reached 2 million boxes, then Firefly could get $30 million profit from this old movie. This money was equivalent to the box office profit of a top 10 movie in North America. While many people who had nothing to do with it were amazed by Eric's vision, the executives who sold all the copyrights of Golden Jade League at the price of $2 million also left Fox in embarrassment. Although public opinion was boiling outside, Eric found that many things were getting more and more wrong. Originally, according to the contract, Columbia should pay more than $88 million of Dark War to Firefly at the end of this month, and the advertising share of Friends should also be settled around the same time. However, when the two big companies were urged by Firefly staff, they found various reasons to repeatedly refuse. Eric even went to Columbia and Fox, but he was rejected by Columbia's CEO, Peter Guber, and Fox's Barry Diller at the same time. This was not the end of it. Next, when Eric asked the newly appointed financial director of Firefly, Carolyn Elliott, to apply for loans from several North American banks with the movie contract in Firefly's hands, all of them were rejected by the other party with the contract terms. December 31st, the last day of the year. Eric returned to the Malibu villa after a fruitless day of running around outside. He sat alone by the window facing the sea and thought for a long time. He sorted out the various unusual small details that he had encountered during this period of time. Only then did he realize that some things had probably started a month ago, and what was about to come might be a very big storm. After thinking for a long time, Eric had to call Jeffrey, who was spending Christmas with Chris in New York. After the call was connected, Eric said in a heavy tone, "Jeffrey, something big may happen." Chapter 278. Eric recounted all the things that had happened over the past few days and his guesses over the phone. Jeffrey in New York also realized the seriousness of the matter and said that he would return to Los Angeles the next morning. After hanging up the phone, Eric sat alone in front of the floor-to-ceiling window and continued to daydream. As the sun completely sank below the sea level, the unlit living room dimmed. He didn't know where the girl had gone. Without orders, the manor's servants wouldn't take the initiative to come here. Therefore, Eric was the only one in the entire villa. It seemed quiet and empty. After an unknown amount of time, the walkie-talkie in the living room beeped. After Eric got up and pressed the button, he heard the voice of the manor's security guard. "Mr. Williams, a man named Arnold Carpenter is here to visit." Eric wondered, "I don't know such a person. Did he say what he wanted?" The security guard said, "No, but he said he was the messenger." "Messenger," Eric repeated in a low voice. Soon, he thought of something and said to the security guard, "Let him in." "Okay, Mr. Williams," the other party said and ended the call. Eric turned on all the lights in the living room. The originally dark living room was soon as bright as day. Then, Eric walked to the study. A few minutes later, a gentle-looking Caucasian man with glasses walked in with a black leather bag. Under the bright lights, he looked around at the gorgeous interior of the mansion and let out a few soft sighs of admiration. Although he knew that he might not be able to own such a mansion in his lifetime, when he thought of what he was going to do today, he couldn't help but feel a little self-satisfied. Seeing that Eric wasn't in the living room, the man didn't stand on ceremony at all. He walked to the sofa by the floor-to-ceiling window and sat down. He looked at the sparkling sea outside the window and patiently waited for the owner to appear. After a while, Eric walked out of the study and saw the strange man sitting on the sofa. He frowned slightly, but soon calmed down and walked toward the strange man. Upon hearing the footsteps, the man stood up but didn't move. He stood in his spot and waited for Eric to approach before extending his hand and introducing himself. "Hello, Mr. Williams. My name is Arnold Carpenter." Eric extended his hand and shook hands with him, but he didn't say a word. Seeing that Arnold Carpenter didn't mind his coldness and was about to return to his seat, Eric said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Carpenter. This is my favorite seat." Please sit over there. Arnold Carpenter's expression changed, but a sneer quickly appeared on his face. He pretended to be cool as he stood up and said, "As you wish, Mr. Williams." Eric sat down in the seat that Arnaud had vacated before looking at Arnaud Captain, who was sitting opposite him, and saying, "I heard that you're a messenger, so tell me why you're here." Arnaud Carpenter didn't immediately speak. Instead, he opened his briefcase and took out a stack of photos. He pushed it in front of Eric and said, "Mr. Williams, you can take a look at these first." Eric took the thick stack of photos and saw that the first one was a photo of Drew curled up in his arms like a kitten. The photo was taken a few weeks ago at the entrance of Malibu Manor when the lass complained that she had knocked her knee. Eric came to a realization. So his feeling that day wasn't wrong. Someone was indeed following and secretly taking photos of him. Then, perhaps the other feelings he had over the past few days weren't wrong. Although he was alarmed, Eric still flipped through the rest of the photos without batting an eyelid. Apart from the intimate photos of him and Drew, he didn't miss a single woman who had interacted with him. The photos spanned an entire year, and there were even many photos that Eric couldn't recall at a glance. He needed to recall carefully to roughly remember the time and place of the photos. Moreover, these photos were taken very cleverly. It was obvious at a glance that the relationship between the man and woman in the photos wasn't simple. After looking at the photos, Eric immediately confirmed that this matter was related to Fox. This was because Murdoch had personally admitted that a reporter from News Corporation's New York Post had secretly followed and taken photos of him for several months. Moreover, there were photos of him and Nicole in the stack of photos, but none of them were of him and Elizabeth. If these were the handiwork of other forces, then wouldn't the newly risen famous director's relationship with the media tycoon's daughter be even more sensational if it was exposed? However, although he could see Fox's figure in the photos, Eric was certain that things were far from simple. If News Corporation was the only one who wanted to use these tricks to force him to submit, the result would only be to push him to other forces. Neither Murdoch nor Barry Diller would be that stupid. After casually tossing the photos in his hand onto the coffee table in front of him, Eric raised his head and stared coldly at Arnold Carpenter. "What's the meaning of this?" Arnold Carpenter slightly avoided Eric's cold and threatening gaze and said, "Mr. Williams, you're asking the obvious." Eric said without a trace of fluctuation in his voice, "Do you think that these little tricks can affect me?" Arnold Carpenter said, "Whether it's possible or not will depend on whether my boss is willing or not. Mr. Williams, you have to understand that in the history of Hollywood, there are many famous figures like you who may have disappeared like a meteor because of one or two inconspicuous scandals." "Do you need me to list a few?" Eric said in a deep voice, "Me and the women in the photos are all consensual. If exposed, I will at most be treated as a playboy by the public. There are many playboys in Hollywood." Arnold Carpenter sneered as he sat up straight and said, "Mr. Williams, the public you speak of is the most ignorant group. The kind of person they will treat you as depends on the kind of person the media that controls public opinion wants them to treat you as. And the person who asked me to pass the message just happens to control a large portion of the media in North America. So, these photos are enough to make you infamous. Moreover, this is only the beginning. After this small trouble, there will be bigger trouble waiting for you." Hearing Arnold Carpenter's words, a strange look flashed in Eric's eyes. However, he quickly concealed this emotion and said in a slightly angry tone, "Mr. Carpenter, can you tell me who the boss behind you are, or who the bosses are?" Seeing that Eric was finally angered by him, Arnold Carpenter said proudly, "Mr. Williams, you are so smart. How can you not guess?" "Okay," Eric continued, "then, what are their conditions?" 40% of Firefly shares, Arnold Carpenter said smoothly as if he was reciting from a book. He then said, "You see, Mr. Williams, the boss who asked me to pass the message isn't greedy at all. If you give up 40% of Firefly's shares, then you will still be the biggest shareholder of Firefly. But if you don't agree, when everything starts, you will have to pay a much higher price to make my boss stop." Eric snorted. 40% of the shares didn't seem greedy. However, if he lost this 40% shares and subtracted the 3% shares he just transferred to Jeffrey not long ago, he only had 42% left. Although he was still the biggest shareholder of Firefly, he didn't have absolute control. And although Robert Shea's talent was mediocre, he had always been a person with a strong desire for control. If those people promised Robert Shea what he wanted after getting 40% of the shares, Eric was sure that Robert Shea would definitely side with them. At that time, Eric would also lose control of Firefly. After merging with New Line, Firefly, which had a film distribution channel, was still not as big as the Seven Giants, but it had the embryonic stage of developing into a film giant. Once he lost control of Firefly, Eric was sure that it would be difficult for him to develop a film company with a complete distribution channel under the joint suppression of the 7 major film companies. In addition, with the arrival of the 1990s, film companies and media groups would usher in a big trend of integration. At that time, facing the film giants merged with media groups, Eric would only be left further and further behind. Even if he could still make blockbuster movies, it would be impossible for him to have the ability to bargain with those film companies. In the end, he would only be a chess piece of the big companies, not a player who could change the game of chess. After thinking about this, Eric didn't want to pretend to be polite with a stranger. He directly asked him to leave. "Mr. Carpenter, right? Go back and tell your boss that if he wants Firefly, he can come and get it. Let's see if he can get it." Arnold Carpenter's expression became even more proud. He then said, "Mr. Williams, my boss already guessed that you would reject the suggestion because you are young and impetuous, so he asked me to tell you that you still have a day to think about it tomorrow. Calm down a little and think about it carefully. You see, this villa is so luxurious and luxurious. To maintain everything here, I'm afraid the annual expenditure is no less than $1 million, right?" As if he didn't hear Arnold Carpenter's words, Eric pointed to the door and said, "Mr. Carpenter, actually, I'm very uncomfortable with a stranger like you appearing here, so please leave immediately. I'm afraid that I won't be able to control myself and have the security throw you into the sea. You should know that this is private property, and I have the right to do so." Chapter 279. Seeing that Eric was about to explode at any moment, Arnold Carpenter didn't stay any longer. He put down a business card with a simple contact number and said, "Mr. Williams, whenever you want to talk, you can call this number." With that said, Arnold Carpenter got up and left. Eric threw the business card into the trash can and walked to the study on the lower floor. He took out a recording pen from his pocket and pressed the play button. The two people's conversation could be heard. Then, he took out a videotape that he had just recorded from a machine with a monitor in the study. He turned on the VCR and inserted the tape into it. The image of Arnold Carpenter sitting in front of the camera appeared on the TV screen. The high quality of the video allowed Arnold Carpenter's every move to be seen clearly. Even an ordinary person could roughly tell what Arnold was saying from the movement of his lips. The videotape didn't last long, and it ended very quickly. Eric put the recording pen and the videotape into the safe and locked it before he let out a sigh of relief. At the very least, he wouldn't be in a predicament like Michael Jackson in his previous life, where he couldn't defend himself at all. It was funny to say that under normal circumstances, very few people would install cameras in their own homes. However, this villa was built according to the Iron Man mansion in his memory. Since it was an imitation, he couldn't forget these small details. It wasn't just the living room. Many places in the villa were connected to his study. As long as Eric wanted to, he could sit in the study and see what was going on in the villa. He didn't expect that his momentary interest back then would allow him to obtain something that was very important to him today. January 1st, 1990, New Year's Day. Jeffrey returned to Los Angeles at around 10 in the morning. Chris Hansen had also accompanied him. Chris had already quit his job at Morgan Stanley and had been preparing for an investment company. When he heard from his father about Eric's situation, Chris was worried and followed him to Los Angeles. After learning the details of the matter, not only did the three fail to come up with a solution, but they also found that Firefly was now facing a lot of thorny problems. However, Jeffrey and Chris did not mention that Eric should compromise with those people. In the end, they decided to deal with them according to the situation. New Year's Day seemed to pass by peacefully, but it was like the calm before the storm. On January 2nd, Eric woke up early in the morning and asked the servant to bring him today's newspaper. The headline of the Los Angeles City paper was in bold black. Eric Williams, Hollywood's most hypocritical playboy. Ha! How merciless! Eric glanced at a few photos on the front page. Photos of him with several women appeared on the front page without showing a single one. The content of the article was even more outrageous. It distorted the fact that Eric liked to chase after beautiful women to a large extent, portraying him as a shameless person who couldn't get a role from an actress without paying a price. He then flipped through a few other newspapers. Although the more well-known ones such as the Los Angeles Times, which had high credibility, did not have such news, there were many reports similar to the Los Angeles Metropolitan News in the next section of newspapers. Since the end of the era of big studios and the Hollywood film industry became more and more complete, the so-called unspoken rules no longer had a place to survive. Stars were no longer members of big studios without personal freedom. Therefore, they no longer had to compromise and be played by those powerful people. However, this did not mean that the unspoken rules had disappeared, but that it was all out in the open. In Hollywood, if an actor wanted to climb all the way up without any background, he or she had to pay for it with his or her own body. Therefore, many years later, an American magazine listed dozens of secrets to success on how to become a star. The first one was, regardless of whether you were a man or a woman, or what your sexual orientation was, if you wanted to become a star, you must always be ready to provide pleasurable services to those who can pave the way for your career. Of course, although this kind of thing was very common in Hollywood, most people silently abided by these rules and did not break them. Occasionally, there would be a few rebels who were unwilling to accept it, but they could hardly make any waves. The public was not ignorant of the situation in Hollywood, but what they could see had always been the most gorgeous and brilliant side of Hollywood. Therefore, most Hollywood stars had a very positive image in the eyes of the public, and everyone was happy to indulge in this kind of fictitious vanity. Today, after someone suddenly distorted the scandal between the famous Hollywood director Eric Williams and many actresses and publicized it with great fanfare, Eric had undoubtedly become a rebel of Hollywood's rules. Therefore, after reading these articles, Eric's image in the eyes of the public would definitely plummet. Within a few hours of the new day's newspaper being released, Eric's mansion in Malibu was surrounded by paparazzi who heard the news. Eric had originally planned to go out, but seeing this situation, he could only stay in the manor obediently. In a small villa in Beverly Hills, Jennifer Aniston was waving the newspaper in her hand and screaming at Nicole, who was sitting at the dining table. Why, I treat you as a good friend, but you did this. You B*TCH, Drew is also a B*TCH, and also, Julia Roberts, and Jennifer Aniston read out a series of names in the newspaper with an agitated expression, then tore the newspaper into powder and threw it at Nicole. You're all B*cheese, I've had enough. Nicole calmly took out the paper that flew into her collar and said, You said we're all B*cheese, then what are you? If it weren't for Eric, would you have gotten the role of the female lead in Friends? Would you be as famous as you are now? Jennifer Aniston was speechless, then said, I'm his girlfriend. So what? Nicole looked up and said casually, Even if you're married, so what? You. Jennifer Aniston pointed at Nicole and gritted her teeth. Then, she went back to her bedroom and stuffed her things into a simple suitcase. She pulled it out and slapped a check in front of Nicole. This is my rent. From today onwards, I have nothing to do with you. Oh. Nicole picked up the check and looked at it, then folded it and put it away carefully. She said, I'll take the extra money as a tip. B*TCH. Jennifer Aniston cursed again, then pulled the suitcase and walked out. Nicole looked at the door of the living room and heard a loud bang. She picked up a piece of newspaper that was scattered on the dining table and opened it to read the content. She muttered, What an idiot. She couldn't even tell that B*starred was in trouble. She only knows how to be jealous. Jennifer Aniston stuffed the suitcase into her car. As soon as she opened the door of the small courtyard, she was surrounded by a few paparazzi before she could get in the car. Miss Jennifer Aniston, what do you think of the content in today's newspaper? Jennifer, will you break up with Mr. Williams? Miss Jennifer Aniston, you live with Miss Nicole Kidman. Does that mean that you already know about her relationship with Eric Williams? Hearing the buzzing around her, Jennifer Aniston pushed away a recording device in front of her in annoyance and shouted, "Get out of here. From now on, I have nothing to do with Eric Williams. Don't bother me anymore." The reporters became even more excited when they saw Jennifer Aniston lose her composure. This was the effect they wanted. If the person involved showed a calm expression, they would not be able to get more explosive information out of her. "Jenny, will you continue to act in Friends?" "Miss Jennifer Aniston, are you sure you just said that you want to break up with Eric Williams?" "Jenny." Jennifer Aniston pushed through the crowd with a cold face and got into the car. She slowly drove the car onto the road to get rid of the paparazzi. After wandering aimlessly in the streets and alleys of Los Angeles for a few hours, her mobile phone rang. After she picked it up and heard her father's voice, Jennifer Aniston slowly parked the car on the side of the road and finally cried into the phone. "We are now reporting live for you at the entrance of Eric Williams Manor in Malibu. Since the day before yesterday, Eric Williams' scandal with many female celebrities suddenly broke out, but it has been more than 72 hours since then. The Manor's gate is still closed, and Eric Williams has not come out to clarify anything." A woman in a blue suit held a microphone and stood outside the bustling crowd of reporters as she spoke to the camera. Behind her was the tightly shut gate of Malibu's Pointy Corner Manor. Although 3 full days had passed, the storm in the newspapers still showed no signs of subsiding. Therefore, the number of reporters at the Manor's gate did not decrease, but kept increasing. At present, there were at least more than 100 people gathered. Due to the impact of Eric Williams' scandal, this week, the box office of the 5 movies released by Firefly have been affected to varying degrees. Among them, Sleepless in Seattle was the most seriously affected by the scandal. The next week's box office fell by more than 40% and only earned $17 million. The other 3 movies, Island Horror, Home Alone 2, and Steel Magnolias, also fell more than expected. Smelling Women was not released on a large scale, so it suffered the least impact. According to the data released by the relevant statistical agency, due to the impact of the Eric Williams scandal, the total box office loss of the 5 movies may exceed $100 million. Drew Barrymore, Julia Roberts, Nicole Kidman, and Virginia Madsen, who were implicated by the Eric Williams scandal, are all currently in a state of silence. None of them have come forward to make any statements. As for whether they have been warned by certain forces, we have no way of knowing. Eric Williams' girlfriend, Jennifer Aniston, announced on the day of the scandal that she broke up with Eric Williams. The copyright of Friends, starring Jennifer Aniston, is completely owned by Firefly. After the couple turned against each other, the cast of the 2nd season of Friends also had a lot of suspense. In an interview with the Manhattan Morning Post, the famous model Lee Zimmerman, who had an outstanding performance in Home Alone 2, publicly said that Eric Williams is a very gentle and considerate man. Many of the newspaper's attacks on the young director are completely slanderous. So far, she is the only actress in Eric's movies who has defended Eric Williams. In the Malibu mansion, Eric sat motionless on the sofa, watching the rolling news about himself on the TV not far away. The coffee table in front of him and the floor were covered with all kinds of newspapers. Drew was holding a small tray with a few exquisite dishes on it. She carefully moved in front of Eric. "Eric, do you want to eat something?" Eric's eyes that were originally fixed on the TV moved, then he turned his head to look out the window. There were still a few pieces of trash floating on the blue sea. He didn't know when, but the sky had darkened again. "Put it there, I'll eat later." Drew obediently put the tray in front of her on the coffee table and tidied up the scattered newspapers before carefully moving to Eric's side. After being with Eric for a long time, the girl could acutely feel any slight emotional changes on Eric. Now she could feel that Eric was very angry, the kind that could explode at any time. Although she knew that Eric would definitely not vent his anger on her, the girl still became timid. She quietly sat next to Eric for a while before she said, "Eric, how about I?" Eric looked at the girl in confusion. I think, you might need to vent a little." Drew's tone was hesitant. Eric smiled bitterly. Do you think it's not chaotic enough right now? How about? Eric stopped Drew's actions and rubbed the girl's fluffy head. He forced a smile and said, Okay, I'm really not in the mood right now. When Drew heard Eric's words, she stopped moving. However, she still stayed next to Eric and said, Eric, no matter what they do, I'll always be yours. You misunderstood, Drew. Actually, I called them to stop them from talking. In this situation, it's best if they don't talk. Okay, I know. Drew obediently snorted. She had no intention of refuting Eric's words. At this time, whatever Eric said was right. Chapter 280. While the two of them were talking softly, the mobile phone on the coffee table rang. The girl eagerly took the phone and placed it next to Eric's ear. She then leaned on Eric. Eric hugged the girl's waist and pressed the answer button with his other hand. Jeffrey's concerned voice sounded from the other end of the phone. Eric, are you okay now? I'm fine. I'm watching the show. How's the company doing now? Eric glanced at the news that was still playing on the TV. However, his tone was a little forced. He wasn't the kind of person who had a strong will. How could he not feel when facing such a large-scale attack? If he hadn't left some bargaining chips in advance, Eric didn't know what he would have done now. The company's situation is still stable, but a few unimportant staff members resigned today. They probably couldn't stand the pressure of public opinion, so I didn't ask them to stay. Also, Robert tested me in the afternoon. Although he didn't say it explicitly, he seemed to want me to persuade you. I guess he was hinted at by some people. Don't worry about him. Do what you need to do. I understand. I'm just telling you about this. Also, when do you plan to fight back? You can't let things go on like this, right? Eric paused and said, Now is not the time. By the way, how's the money? When Jeffrey heard this question, his tone became a little heavy. He said, It's all delayed. I personally went to Columbia and Fox, but I didn't see any of the people in charge. I asked Edward, and he said that if this kind of thing goes to court, although we will definitely win, it will take a few months. As for the loan, Carolyn contacted a few banks. Originally, Citibank was already interested and agreed to lend us $50 million. However, Disney and Fox sent a lawyer's letter together, saying that there was a problem with the contract between the two parties. They stopped Citibank from lending us the loan, and this matter fell through again. What do you think they're trying to achieve by doing this? Eric asked as he thought to himself. On the other end of the phone, Jeffrey said, I think it might be related to tax. However, if such a problem really arises, I think the IRS will definitely allow us to delay tax payments since Firefly is such a well-run company. What Jeffrey could think of, Eric could also think of. Therefore, he knew that the next storm would definitely be related to money. Moreover, it would probably be a large sum of money. Otherwise, the major companies would not try to stop Firefly from obtaining funds. Jeffrey, don't think about those two sums of money for the time being. Try your best to get Carolyn to try getting a loan. If the domestic banks aren't enough, then try the overseas ones. Since Citibank is willing to let us go, I think there will be other banks willing to lend us. I know. Actually, Eric, Carolyn told me that there is another way to get a loan, which is to mortgage your shares in Firefly. This way, the other companies will definitely have no reason to stop it. Eric denied without hesitation. Jeffrey, there's no room for negotiation. Our opponents are trying their best to get their hands on Firefly's shares. Can you guarantee that I'll be able to get them back after I mortgage them? I mean, if it's just a small part, such as 10%. No, Jeffrey, don't talk about this anymore. Eric continued, Oh yeah, since they've already made a move, we can't just sit back and do nothing. Stop the production of Who Will Be a Millionaire and The X-Files. Also, let out news that there might not be a second season of Friends. Eric paused for a second and said with disappointment, There might not be a second season. Jeffrey heard Eric say this and was silent for a moment before saying, Eric, Why don't I talk to Jenny? She was probably just impulsive. Now, she definitely understands your situation. Eric sighed. He remembered that a few days ago, John Jennifer Aniston personally called to scold him and warned him not to get close to her daughter. Eric said dispiritedly, "No need." Jeffrey on the other side of the phone shook his head and said, "Okay then. Alright, Eric, don't watch TV all day. Don't read the newspapers either. You know that those are all fake. Or find something else to do, such as writing a script or something." Eric thought for a moment and said, "Why don't you help me find a band?" "Band? Why are you looking for that? I have a feeling and want to make a song." Jeffrey knew that Eric knew some movie soundtracks and had seen Eric's songs. He didn't suspect anything and nodded. "Then, what kind of band do you want?" Eric said, "Rock band, industrial heavy metal. Find me the best." Okay." After a few more words, the two of them hung up the phone. Eric pushed away the little girl who had been leaning on him and listening attentively. He turned off the TV and said a few words before going into his study. The next day, Jeffrey found the best rock band in Los Angeles for Eric. Together with a whole truck of music production equipment, they were sent to the Malibu Manor. In the next few days, the paparazzi who were still waiting for Eric's appearance could occasionally hear faint rock music coming from the manor. The storm had been brewing for a week, but Eric still didn't give any response. However, the matter didn't show any signs of dissipating. Outside the Malibu Manor and the Firefly office building, protesters holding banners appeared one after another. They demanded that Eric announce his retirement from the ranks of directors and that he would no longer harm Hollywood. Some media outlets that wanted to maintain fairness occasionally published a few rational analysis articles about the storm, but they were all buried by the one-sided carnival of public opinion. After all, to trample a famous genius director who was also a billionaire into the dust was very much in line with the dark desires of many people. At the beginning of a new week, the storm began to escalate. Eric woke up in the morning, and before he had time to eat breakfast, he received 4 subpoenas from the Los Angeles District Court in one go. Drew Barrymore's father, John Barrymore Jr., jumped out and submitted a series of evidence. He accused his ex-wife, Ediko Gide, of being indifferent to his daughter and even allowing his underage daughter to be taken care of by Eric Williams. While suing to take back custody of Drew, he also sued Eric for violating his daughter. A clerk in charge of real estate management in the Los Angeles County took the initiative to expose that Eric Williams had used illegal means such as bribery when he obtained 14 acres of public land at the tip of Malibu. A little-known screenwriter in Hollywood, Randy Clapp, sued Eric Williams for plagiarism of the script for his movie, Dark War, a police movie he had written 5 years ago, the struggle between the light and the dark, and demanded compensation of $200 million from Eric Williams. The newly established Sony Pictures also came to join in the fun. They sued Eric for fraud in the contract signed with Columbia Pictures for Dark War. Eric's share of the profits seriously exceeded the normal commercial contract. Sony Pictures asked to reinvestigate the inside story of the contract signing. When the news that Eric was facing 4 lawsuits at the same time came out, not only in North America, but all the media in the Western world focused their attention on Eric. At the same time, many people realized that the matter was far from as simple as they thought. However, even so, most people just watched the development of the matter with the mentality of watching a good show. In the Malibu Tip Villa, Eric and the private lawyer, Edward Lewis, who had just arrived, were discussing the 4 lawsuits in front of them. "Eric, this matter is getting more and more troublesome. You must have seen that there must be a powerful force behind these lawsuits. Therefore, to be honest, I can't guarantee you that you can win all 4 lawsuits. Since they can find so many people, it will be difficult to control the future judges, juries, and other factors. After all, you are now in an extremely weak position." Eric listened quietly to Edward's analysis. When the private lawyer finished speaking, he said, "Edward, just do your best." "That's for sure." Edward nodded and continued, "Among the 4 lawsuits, the lawsuit regarding the plagiarism of Dark War is the easiest. I've already asked someone to find the original script written by the screenwriter. Although the story of battle between light and dark is indeed somewhat similar to Dark War, it's only a little similar in general. It's also a contest between a police officer and a criminal, but the details of the story are worlds apart. Also, for the lawsuit against Sony, I signed the contract with Columbia personally. I promise there will not be any problems. As for the other two cases, Edward looked up at Eric and said, "When I helped you buy the land in Malibu, I did use some inappropriate methods. However, I used all cash in the process, so there's no way I could have left any evidence. Even if I can prove it in the end, I will not let you be implicated. You can just insist that you did not know about it." Eric could tell that Edward was trying to take responsibility for this matter. He nodded gratefully and said, "Thank you, Edward. Oh, you don't have to worry too much about the last lawsuit." "Are you sure?" Edward looked at Eric and said, "I was about to say that this lawsuit is the most dangerous one. If you are not careful, you might lose." Eric shook his head confidently and said, "Don't worry. I will not lose." Edward was not sure about the relationship between Eric and his daughter, but he nodded when he saw how confident Eric was. Chapter 281. The black MPV stopped outside a condominium in Culver City, Los Angeles. Several burly bodyguards quickly got out of the car and separated them from the crowd of reporters. Drew, who was wearing a conservative casual outfit and a pair of sunglasses, got out of the MPV. Under the protection of the bodyguards, he passed through the crazy crowd of reporters and entered the condominium without saying a word. Although the reporters would often do anything to obtain news, they did not dare to trespass in broad daylight. They could only wait outside the condominium in disappointment. "Okay, tell me. What's going on this time?" Drew walked into the condominium and sat down on the sofa in the living room. He took off his sunglasses and looked coldly at his mother, Edith Gideon. It had been almost a year since she last saw her daughter. Originally, Ediko Gide had wanted to say a few intimate words to her, but when she heard her daughter treating her so coldly, Ediko Gide was instantly displeased. "I'm your mother. Is this how you speak to me? I'm asking you, what's going on?" Drew stood up abruptly and threw his sunglasses to the floor. The broken lenses splashed all over the floor. Edith Gideon was startled by her daughter's sudden outburst, but she refused to back down. "Why are you angry at me? It's all because of you and Eric Williams. Your bastard father even sued me. Now I have to pay for the lawsuit. Let me tell you, you have to compensate me double the amount. Otherwise, I can forget about this lawsuit. Just let your bastard father take you away. I'm just asking, did you accept anyone's money this time?" Drew raised his voice and asked. Edith Gideon waved her arms agitatedly. "What money? Who would give me money? I think all the money has been given to your bastard father. I haven't seen a single cent, and I still have to pay for the lawsuit. I still have to pay for the lawsuit." Drew stared at his mother for a while, then took out a check from his handbag and threw it at her. He warned, "Take this money. You don't have to hire a lawyer. Just shut up. Also, don't let me find out what kind of messy things you've been doing behind my back. Otherwise, I'll let you know what it means to be desolate in your old age." When Edith Gide, who had bent down to pick up the check, heard his daughter say that, he wanted to retort, but when he lowered his head and saw the amount on the check, he immediately shut his mouth. The angry expression on his face turned stiff before quickly disappearing. He looked like he was trying to curry favor with his daughter unwillingly. He opened his mouth, but he was momentarily at a loss for words. Drew ignored Ediko Gide and said to a middle-aged maid who was hiding in the kitchen and peeking at the confrontation between the mother and daughter in the living room, "Madam Martha, go tidy up my room. I'll be staying here for a while." "No problem, Miss Drew," the maid said as she hurried out of the kitchen and went upstairs. Drew waited for the maid to disappear around the corner of the stairs before saying to Ediko Gideon, "During this period of time, you're not allowed to attend any random gatherings or parties. You're not allowed to accept invitations from strangers. Also, you're not allowed to bring any men home. I'm your mother." Ediko Gide couldn't help but retort again. Drew immediately stretched out her hand and said, "Give me back the check." Edeko Gide subconsciously took a step back and stuffed the check into his pocket. He stuttered a few times before asking, "How long will it take?" "After this is over," Drew said. She walked to the door and instructed the bodyguard to bring her luggage in. She left Edeko Gide in the living room and went upstairs. In the United States, it was very rare for a civil lawsuit to reach the final trial. More than 90% of the cases were settled before the final trial. Therefore, when Drew's father sued Eric, Eric's legal team immediately contacted John Barrymore privately in an attempt to settle the case. However, the other party directly offered a compensation of up to $10 million, which was no different from extortion. Eric's lawyer, Edward Lewis, had a private negotiation with John Barrymore, but the other party was unwilling to give in at all. In the end, they had no choice but to go to court. January 16th, the third week after the storm began. The media was still using all kinds of negative information to smear Eric's reputation. At the same time, John Barrymore's case against his ex-wife, Edeko Gide, and the famous director, Eric Williams, was in court for the first time. Early in the morning, the number of reporters outside Eric's Malibu Point Manor had increased to more than 300. The number of reporters at the entrance of the Los Angeles Superior Court was no less than that. Drew and his mother took a business car to the courthouse in downtown Los Angeles. As soon as they got out of the car, they were surrounded by a swarm of reporters. Almost at the same time, Drew's father, John Barrymore, who often appeared in the media as a grieving father, arrived at the same time. Seeing this scene, the reporters seemed to have received some kind of hint and consciously made a path between Drew and John Barrymore. Drew got out of the car, carrying a sling bag that looked a little heavy. With a smile on his face, he walked directly through the crowd and walked toward John Barrymore amidst the flashing lights. John Barrymore didn't expect his daughter to take the initiative to walk over. Although he showed the image of a loving father who felt sorry for his daughter in the media, he didn't feel much affection for this girl from the bottom of his heart. Of course, when his daughter took the initiative to come over, it was impossible for John Barrymore to not have any reaction. After thinking about it, John Barrymore showed a gentle smile and walked toward Drew at the same time, as if he wanted to give his daughter a warm hug. Seeing this scene, the flashing lights of the surrounding reporters became more rapid. These reporters paid far more attention to this storm than the general public, so they also had a deep understanding of the inside story of this lawsuit. Seeing this situation, many people acutely realized that Drew Barrymore might have sided with her father. In that case, Eric Williams would definitely lose this lawsuit. When the father and daughter were about a meter away from each other, John Barrymore smiled and opened his arms, wanting to give his daughter a hug. After all, this gesture had to be done. Drew tilted her head slightly and stared at her father, the smile on her face becoming more and more strange. One hand reached into the sling bag, she took a step forward and quickly took out a red brick from the bag. While John Barrymore was unprepared, she mercilessly slapped the man's face in front of her. Bang! Everyone around, including John Barrymore himself, was stunned. The flashing lights stopped at this moment, and the atmosphere was cold for a few seconds. John Barrymore then felt a sharp pain coming from the bridge of his nose. He wanted to raise his hand to touch his bleeding nose, but he felt that he couldn't exert any strength. His eyes rolled back, and he fainted on the ground. It wasn't until John Barrymore fell to the ground with a plop that the people who had fallen into a daze woke up from their stupor. The reporters in the front row began to press their shutters hastily. The reporters at the back who realized what had happened also raised their cameras in their hands and pressed the shutters randomly while trying to squeeze to the front. The flashing lights flashed crazily again. A few quick-witted bodyguards stepped forward to protect Drew in the middle, blocking the frantic reporters. The girl glanced at the man who had fallen to the ground, patted her clothes, and then pushed away a security guard in front of her. She said to a pile of recording equipment in front of her, "I don't care what you write, but I still want to say that I have nothing to do with this man. From the beginning of my memory, every time this man appeared, it was a disaster for me and my mother. He always beat and scolded us mercilessly, and then took away the living expenses I earned from shooting advertisements, causing my mother and I to live in poverty. Since you reporters claim to be everywhere, then go and investigate. See what this man has been doing all these years, and see if he's worthy of being my father." After that, Drew whispered something to the bodyguards. A few bodyguards protected Drew and walked back to the MPV they came in. Poor John Barrymore was carried to the hospital after the reporters left with Drew. "Drew, is what you said true? Miss Barrymore, say a few more words." "Drew, he's your father after all. Don't you think it's too cold to do this?" Amidst the frenzied shouts of the reporters, the door of the MPV was pulled shut, and then it slowly drove out of the parking lot. Because the person involved, John Barrymore, was injured by his daughter, today's trial had to end before it started. Eric, who was still on the road, heard the news and smiled bitterly in the car. He then asked the driver to turn around and return to Malibu Manor. Drew's words were said in front of hundreds of reporters. Of course, there was no possibility of it being distorted or hidden. On the day of the incident, the exact words were published in the media. Then, some media investigated John Barrymore's past according to Drew's words. As an actor, John Barrymore has been unemployed since 1976. Moreover, before Drew Barrymore was born, John Barrymore abandoned both mother and daughter. In the police records, not only did John Barrymore have various illegal records, but there was also a record of his ex-wife being arrested in 1977 because she couldn't stand his violence. Such a man really doesn't deserve to be a father. Although John Barrymore didn't fulfill his responsibility as a father, Drew Barrymore's actions were too cold. John Barrymore is her biological father after all. Even if she doesn't agree with some of her father's actions, she shouldn't attack her own father. Our reporter learned from the hospital where John Barrymore is hospitalized that Mr. John Barrymore is seriously injured. In addition to a broken nose, there are 7 contusions of different degrees on his face. There may be a risk of disfigurement. John Barrymore made a statement through his agent, saying that he did make mistakes in the past. Although he has turned over a new leaf, he doesn't hate his daughter for what she did yesterday. He only hopes that Miss Drew Barrymore can return to the normal path of her life. Therefore, his attitude won't change because of this incident. He swore to let Eric Williams get the punishment he deserves. An hour after John Barrymore's statement, he made another statement. He hopes that the Los Angeles court can approve a mental evaluation of his daughter, Drew Barrymore. He suspects that his daughter has been brainwashed by Eric Williams. At the same time, Mr. John Barrymore hopes that Eric Williams will be placed under house surveillance before the case is closed, to prevent Eric Williams from transmitting malicious instructions to his daughter. If Drew had been a pure and innocent little girl without any criminal record, this incident might have brought about a slight turnaround. However, due to the girl's messing around in the past few years, and her own history wasn't clean either. Therefore, after the incident, the media took advantage of the situation and brought her back to her original path. "Alright, I'm hanging up. Don't mess around like this next time. Doing so will only make things more troublesome." I know, but doing that won't solve any problems. Be good." "Well, that's all." Eric put down the phone and looked at Robert Shea, who was drinking coffee on the other side. Due to various reasons, this was the first time the two of them had met since the incident. And this time, it was Eric who had taken the initiative to invite him. According to the news that Jeffrey revealed from time to time, Robert Shea had originally maintained a neutral attitude. However, from this week onwards, Robert Shea might have felt that Eric might not be able to survive this storm. Therefore, his attitude had clearly changed. Not only did he attempt to interfere with the production of the X-Files and Who Will Become a Millionaire, which Eric was originally directly in charge of, he even found a reason to reprimand the financial director, Carolyn Elliott, whom Eric had personally appointed, during a meeting. Eric knew that these were just Robert Shea's probing. If he didn't make any statements, then Robert Shea would definitely proceed with the next move without hesitation. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.